The church doors exploded inward with a crash that shook dust from the rafters. Margaret Hale's hands froze on her wheelchair as three men swaggered down the aisle, their laughter echoing like breaking glass. A cripple playing bride? Mayor Tate's voice dripped venom. Her father's killers had come to finish what they started, but they didn't see the silent cowboy rise behind them, didn't see death itself step from the shadows. Before you discover how this story ends, follow along and comment your city below so I can see how far Margaret's courage travels. The Wyoming wind howled like a wounded animal outside the small wooden church, rattling the warped window frames and sending fingers of cold air through every crack in the walls. Inside, candlelight flickered against whitewashed boards, casting dancing shadows that seemed to whisper warnings nobody wanted to hear. Margaret Hale sat alone in her wheelchair at the back of the church, her gloved hands gripping the worn wooden armrests so tightly her knuckles had gone white beneath the thin fabric. She was 26 years old and had been beautiful once, the kind of beautiful that made young ranch hands stammer and forget their own names. Her hair, the color of autumn wheat, was pulled back in a simple bun that did nothing to hide the sharp intelligence in her gray-green eyes. Those eyes had seen too much for someone so young. They held the weight of grief and rage, and something harder, something that made men uncomfortable when they looked at her directly. Determination, maybe, or the kind of fury that burns so hot it turns to ice. The wheelchair was 4 years old, constructed of bent wood and iron by a blacksmith who'd wept while he worked. The left wheel squeaked, had squeaked since the day she'd first sat in it, her spine shattered and her father's blood still drying on her riding dress. She'd never had it fixed. The sound reminded her what they'd taken, reminded her why she was here, about to marry a man she barely knew, in a ceremony that felt more like a business transaction than a wedding. But business was what kept you alive in the Wyoming Territory in 1883. Love was a luxury for people who weren't drowning. Reverend Paul Michaels stood at the altar, his weathered hands clasping a worn Bible against his chest like a shield. He was a good man, one of the few left in Sweetwater Springs who hadn't bent his knee to Mayor Randall Tate's corruption. His presence here today was a small act of defiance that could cost him everything. Margaret saw the way his fingers trembled slightly, the way his eyes kept darting toward the door. "Are you certain about this, Miss Hale?" His voice was gentle, the kind of gentle that made her want to scream. She'd heard that tone too many times, the pitying, careful way people spoke to her now, as if her broken legs had somehow broken her mind too. "I'm certain, Reverend." Her voice came out stronger than she felt. "Is Mr. Ward here yet?" Before the Reverend could answer, the side door creaked open. Margaret turned her wheelchair, a practiced motion that no longer made her wince with phantom pains, and watched as Elias Ward stepped into the church. He was a tall man, lean in the way of someone who'd known hunger and hard work, with shoulders broad enough to carry more than his share of burden. His hair was dark, almost black, falling past his collar in a way that suggested he cut it himself with a knife when it got in his eyes. He wore his only good shirt, white cotton, carefully cleaned, and dark trousers tucked into worn boots. His hat was in his hands, turning slowly between fingers that were scarred and calloused from work she could only imagine. But it was his eyes that always struck her. Gray as storm clouds, quiet as deep water, holding something ancient and sad that made her chest ache when she looked too long. He'd never spoken to her, couldn't speak to anyone, the town gossip said. But those eyes spoke volumes if you knew how to listen. He crossed the church in that slow, deliberate way he moved, each step measured and purposeful, as if sudden movements were dangerous things. When he reached her, he knelt, actually knelt, so they were eye to eye. He looked at her the way her father used to, before the accident, before everything went dark. Like she was whole, like she was enough. She felt her throat tighten dangerously. "Thank you for coming." He nodded once, then reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out something small wrapped in cloth. He placed it in her hands without ceremony, without the kind of performative gallantry that always made her feel like a charity case. She unwrapped it carefully. It was a carving, no bigger than her palm, a bird in flight, wings spread wide. But one wing was broken, bent at an angle that should have made flight impossible. Yet the bird soared anyway, its head tilted toward the sky with what looked like fierce joy. Margaret's vision blurred. She blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. Not here. Not now. It's beautiful. Elias stood and offered his hand. She took it, feeling the roughness of his palm, the strength in his fingers. He didn't try to lift her, didn't treat her like something fragile. He simply held her hand and waited. "Shall we begin?" Reverend Michaels asked softly. Margaret nodded, and Elias wheeled her forward toward the altar. The Reverend opened his Bible, cleared his throat, and began to speak words about love and commitment that felt surreal in their ordinary beauty. This wasn't a normal wedding. This was survival dressed up in borrowed ceremony. "Marriage is not to be entered into lightly," the Reverend intoned, and Margaret almost laughed at the absurdity. Nothing about her life was light anymore. Everything was heavy, heavy as the iron wheels beneath her, heavy as the debt that threatened to swallow her father's land, heavy as the hatred she carried for the men who'd destroyed her family. She'd posted the notice 3 weeks ago, pinned to the board outside the general store. Seeking husband for marriage of convenience. Must be willing to help manage ranch property. Discretion required. She hadn't expected anyone to respond. Who wanted to marry a crippled woman with more enemies than friends and land that came with a death sentence? Only Elias had come, hat in hand, saying nothing because he couldn't, but he'd handed her a note in careful, cramped handwriting. "I can work, I can protect. I ask nothing but honest work and a place to call home." She'd looked at him then, really looked, and seen something in those storm-gray eyes that made her say yes before her practical mind could list all the reasons this was insane. He was broken too, in his own way. Maybe that's what she needed, someone who understood that healing wasn't always possible, that sometimes you just had to learn to live with the pieces you had left. "Do you, Margaret Ann Hale, take this man?" The church doors exploded inward. The sound was like thunder, like the world splitting open. The heavy oak doors, which should have been barred from inside, flew back on their hinges with such force that one actually splintered against the wall. Cold wind rushed in, extinguishing half the candles and plunging the church into shadow and flickering light. 3 men strode through the entrance as if they owned the world. Maybe they did, at least this corner of it. Mayor Randall Tate entered first, resplendent in a black suit that cost more than most families in Sweetwater Springs made in a year. He was a big man, running to fat now in middle age, with jowls that shook when he laughed and small, piggish eyes that never looked at you. They assessed, calculated, appraised your worth like you were livestock at auction. His hair was slicked back with so much pomade it gleamed in the candlelight, and his smile was the kind that made children cry and dogs growl low in their throats. Behind him came his shadows, Jack Reeves and Cole Mason, the mayor's enforcers. Reeves was thin and wiry, with the kind of nervous energy that spoke of violence always coiled and ready to spring. He had a scar that ran from his left eyebrow down to his jaw, a memento from a knife fight he liked to brag about in saloons. Mason was his opposite. Massive, slow-moving, with hands like ham hocks and eyes that held all the intelligence and mercy of a bull in a slaughterhouse. "Well, well, well." Tate's voice boomed through the church, loud and jovial, in a way that made Margaret's skin crawl. "What do we have here? A wedding." Reverend Michaels stepped forward, his Bible still clutched to his chest. "Mayor Tate, this is a private ceremony. I must ask you to—" "To what, Reverend?" Tate's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "This is a public building, is it not? A house of God? Surely God's house welcomes all his children." "You're not welcome here," Margaret said, her voice cutting through the false joviality like a knife through silk. "Get out." Tate's smile didn't falter, but something cold flickered in his eyes. He walked down the aisle slowly, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, each step a deliberate invasion of her space. Reeves and Mason flanked him, spreading out like wolves cutting off escape routes. "Margaret, Margaret," Tate shook his head in mock sadness. "Is that any way to speak to your mayor, to the man who's made you more than fair offers for that worthless land of yours?" "My father's land," she corrected, her hands tightening on her wheelchair's armrests. "And it's not for sale." "Your father's land," Tate repeated, stopping just a few feet away. He looked down at her, his expression shifting to something that might have been pity if it hadn't been laced with such obvious contempt. "Your father was a fool, Margaret. A fool who didn't understand how business works in the New West. He paid for that foolishness, didn't he? Margaret's jaw clenched so hard she heard her teeth creak. He was murdered. He had an unfortunate accident. Tate's voice was smooth, practiced. Just like you did. Terrible things. Accidents. They happen all the time out here. Why, I'd hate to see another accident befall you now, especially on your wedding day. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Reverend Michaels shifted uncomfortably, and Margaret saw his hand move toward the small cross he wore around his neck, clutching it like a talisman against evil. Elias hadn't moved. He stood beside Margaret's wheelchair, still as stone, his face unreadable. But Margaret felt the change in him, a tension that radiated from his body like heat from a stove. His right hand, which had been hanging loose at his side, was now slightly curved, hovering near his hip, where she knew he kept a knife strapped beneath his shirt. Reeves noticed too. He grinned, showing teeth stained brown from tobacco. The mute cowboy got something to say. Oh wait, that's right. You can't say shit, can you, Ward? Jack, don't be cruel, Tate said, but his tone suggested he found the cruelty amusing. Ward can't help that the war took his voice. Though I do wonder what kind of man marries a cripple for her land. You must be pretty desperate, Ward, or pretty smart. Can't decide which. The ceremony was nearly complete, Reverend Michaels said, finding his courage somewhere in his trembling hands. If you have business with Miss Hale, it can wait until what? Until she's legally protected by marriage. Tate laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. Oh, Reverend, you think a piece of paper changes anything? You think Ward here can protect her? He turned his attention fully to Elias now, circling him like a predator sizing up prey. Elias didn't turn, didn't track him with his eyes, but Margaret could see the way his body adjusted slightly, always keeping Tate in his peripheral vision. You know what I think happened to you in the war, Ward? Tate leaned in close, his breath probably reeking of whiskey and cigars. I think you were a coward. I think you were running when you got shot. That's why you can't talk about it. Shame's got your tongue worse than any bullet. Margaret felt fury rise in her chest, hot and sharp. You don't know about... Shut up, girl. The joviality vanished from Tate's voice like a candle being snuffed. He didn't even look at her, his eyes fixed on Elias. I'm talking to your intended. Tell me, Ward, do you really think you can stand against me? Against my men? Against the entire... Elias moved. It wasn't much. Just a slight shift of his weight, a fractional turn of his shoulders. But something in that small movement made Tate step back, made Reeves's hand dart toward the gun at his hip, made Mason's massive frame go rigid with anticipation. Elias did nothing else. He simply looked at Tate with those storm-gray eyes, and in them Margaret saw something that made her breath catch. Not fear, not anger, something colder and more certain than either. The look of a man who'd measured the distance between himself and death so many times he'd stopped caring about the mathematics. The silence stretched thin and dangerous. Then Tate laughed again, breaking the tension with deliberate force. You've got stones, Ward. I'll give you that. But stones don't stop bullets. He turned back to Margaret, his smile returning like a mask being slipped back into place. Let me make this simple for you, sweetheart. You have two choices. You can sell me that land for the price I'm offering, which is generous, considering it's worthless, or you can watch that land get taken from you anyway when you can't pay your debts. Either way, I win, but one way is a lot less painful for everyone involved. Go to hell, Margaret said flatly. Tate's smile tightened. Such language in a church. Your father would be ashamed. My father would spit in your face. Your father, Tate said, his voice dropping to something soft and dangerous, got himself killed interfering in business that wasn't his concern. He should have taught you better, should have taught you that in this territory power is the only thing that matters. And power, my dear crippled Margaret, is something you don't have. He turned as if to leave, then stopped, snapping his fingers as if he'd just remembered something. Oh, I almost forgot. Jack, show Miss Hale what we think of her little marriage scheme. Reeves moved fast, faster than Margaret expected. He covered the distance between them in 3 long strides. His scarred face split in a grin that held no humor at all. His hand shot out and grabbed the small carved bird from where Margaret had placed it on her lap, holding it up to the flickering candlelight. This your wedding present? He turned it over in his grimy fingers. Cute. Real cute. A broken bird for a broken bride. Give it back, Margaret said, her voice low and dangerous. Or what? Reeves tossed the carving up and caught it, like a child playing with a toy. You gonna wheel over here and take it from me? Margaret's hands moved to the wheels of her chair, ready to do exactly that, but Elias's hand came down gently on her shoulder. One touch, barely there, but she felt the message in it. Wait. Reeves laughed, a high, nasty sound. Oh, look at this. The cripple needs her mute to fight for her. How romantic. He held the carving up higher, dangling it between two fingers. You know what I think? I think this is the perfect symbol for this whole pathetic situation. He dropped it. The carved bird hit the wooden floor and shattered into 3 pieces. Margaret heard a sound escape her throat, something between a gasp and a growl. That carving had meant something. The first thing in 4 years that had made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she could still fly with broken wings. And this bastard had destroyed it like it was nothing. Oops, Reeves said, his grin widening. Guess it wasn't made very well, just like this marriage isn't gonna… Elias moved. One moment he was standing still, the next his hand was locked around Reeves's wrist with a grip that made the smaller man yelp in surprise and pain. Elias's face hadn't changed, still calm, still unreadable, but his eyes had gone cold and flat, like a wolf's eyes in winter. Reeves tried to jerk away and couldn't. He tried again, pulling with all his strength, his face reddening with effort. Elias's grip didn't budge. Instead, Elias began to squeeze. Margaret heard something pop. Cartilage, maybe, or small bones grinding together. Reeves's grin vanished, replaced by a grimace of pain. He clawed at Elias's hand with his free one, but it was like trying to pry open an iron shackle with bare fingers. Jack! Mason lurched forward, his hand going for his gun, but Tate held up a hand to stop him. Not yet, the mayor said quietly, his piggy eyes glittering with something that might have been amusement or anticipation. Let's see what the mute does. Elias slowly, deliberately, forced Reeves to his knees. The scarred man fought it, his boots scrabbling for purchase on the wooden floor, but it was useless. Elias pressed him down with patient, implacable force until Reeves was kneeling on the broken pieces of the carved bird, his wrist twisted at an angle that made Margaret wince in sympathy despite her hatred for the man. Then Elias looked at Tate. Just looked at him, his meaning crystal clear. This is what I can do to your men. Imagine what I can do to you. For a moment, just a heartbeat, Margaret saw something flicker in Tate's eyes. Not quite fear, but a recognition that he might have underestimated the silent cowboy standing before him. Then the mayor laughed, loud and hard. Well, maybe you're not completely useless after all, Ward. Let him go. Elias didn't move. I said let him go, Tate repeated, his voice harder now. Unless you want to see just how fast Mason can draw that gun of his. The church had gone silent except for Reeves's ragged breathing and the wind howling outside. Margaret realized she'd been holding her breath. Slowly, carefully, Elias released Reeves's wrist and stepped back, his hands returning to his sides. Reeves scrambled to his feet, cradling his injured wrist against his chest, his face twisted with humiliation and rage. You son of a… Jack, Tate's voice cracked like a whip. We're leaving. But We're leaving, Tate repeated. He smoothed down his expensive suit and looked at Margaret with an expression that held no warmth, no humanity, just cold calculation. You have 1 week, Miss Hale. 1 week to reconsider my offer. After that, well, accidents happen. You know that better than anyone. He turned and walked toward the door, Mason following like a faithful hound. Reeves lingered, his eyes burning with hatred as he stared at Elias. This ain't over, mute. Not by a long shot. Then he was gone, and the 3 men disappeared into the Wyoming wind, leaving the church feeling somehow colder and darker than before. Reverend Michaels released a breath he'd been holding and sank into the front pew, his legs suddenly unable to support him. Dear God, he whispered. Dear God in heaven. Margaret looked down at the broken pieces of the carved bird scattered across the floor. 4 years of holding herself together, 4 years of refusing to break, and somehow this stupid small destruction was what made her feel like crying. Elias knelt again, gathering the pieces carefully in his large hands. He held them out to her, and she saw that his fingers were trembling slightly. Not from fear, she realized, but from restraint. From the effort it had taken not to snap Reeves's wrists like kindling, not to reach for the knife at his hip and end things the way he'd probably been trained to end things in the war. "It's broken," she said, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. Elias shook his head. He pointed to the pieces, then to her, then made a gesture like putting things together. He'd fix it, the gesture said. Things that were broken could be made whole again, given time and care and steady hands. Margaret looked at this strange, silent man who'd agreed to marry her for reasons she didn't fully understand, who just faced down 3 armed men without saying a word, who was now carefully collecting pieces of carved wood like they were precious jewels. Something shifted in her chest. Not love, not yet, but maybe the first seed of something that could grow into it, given time. "We should finish the ceremony," she said quietly, "before they come back." Reverend Michaels looked up, his face pale. "Miss Hale, perhaps we should postpone. Those men will come back whether we finish today or not," Margaret interrupted. "At least if we're married, the land stays in my name. There are legal protections, however small." "Marriage won't stop Tate," the Reverend said gently. "You know that." "No," Margaret agreed, "but maybe it'll slow him down long enough for us to figure out how to stop him ourselves." Elias stood and offered his hand again. This time, when she took it, she squeezed hard, trying to communicate something she didn't have words for. "Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm glad you're here. I hope I haven't just killed us both." His fingers squeezed back. "I understand. I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure it out together." Reverend Michaels stood on shaky legs and opened his Bible again, finding his place. "Very well," he said, his voice gaining strength. "If you're certain." "I'm certain," Margaret said, and meant it. "Do you, Margaret Ann Hale, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" The words felt heavy with meaning she hadn't expected. This wasn't supposed to be real. This was supposed to be a transaction, a legal maneuver, a chess move in a game she was losing. But looking at Elias, at the way he stood so solid and sure beside her, at the way he'd stepped between her and violence without hesitation, at the way he held broken pieces like they still mattered, she felt the words sink into her bones like truth. "I do," she said clearly. "And do you, Elias Ward, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Elias couldn't speak the words, but he nodded once, firm and certain, his storm-gray eyes never leaving Margaret's face. Then he did something she didn't expect. He took her hand and placed it over his heart, holding it there so she could feel the steady, strong beat beneath his shirt. It was a vow more powerful than any words could be. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, and by God Almighty, I pronounce you husband and wife." Reverend Michaels closed his Bible, looking relieved that they'd made it through. You may seal your union with a kiss, if you wish." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. She hadn't thought about this part, hadn't thought about the actual physical reality of being married, of having a husband who was allowed to touch her, to be close to her in ways no one had been since before the accident. Elias seemed to sense her hesitation. He knelt again, always kneeling, always bringing himself to her level, rather than forcing her to crane her neck to look up at him, and waited. The question was clear in his eyes. "May I?" She nodded, just a tiny movement, and he leaned forward slowly, giving her time to change her mind, to pull away. His lips brushed hers so gently she might have imagined it, a whisper of contact that tasted like promises and hope and something dangerous that might have been the beginning of love. When he pulled back, his eyes held a question. Margaret felt her breath catch, felt something tight and scared in her chest begin to loosen, just a fraction. "Well," she said, trying for levity and almost achieving it, "I suppose that makes it official." Elias smiled, actually smiled, a small curve of his lips that transformed his entire face, making him look younger and less haunted for just a moment. He stood and took the handles of her wheelchair, ready to push her down the aisle and out into whatever came next. But before they could move, the church door opened again. All three of them froze, fear lancing through Margaret like lightning. Had Tate come back? Had he decided 1 week was too generous, that he'd finished this now? But the figure in the doorway wasn't Tate or his men. It was a woman, old, bent with age, wrapped in layers of faded shawls against the cold. She shuffled into the church with the slow determination of someone who'd walked a long way and wouldn't be turned aside. Margaret recognized her. Mary Whitehorse, one of the Cheyenne women who lived on the edge of town. Her husband had died 2 winters ago, and her children had moved north to the reservation. She survived on charity and odd jobs, cleaning houses for people who'd mostly forgotten how to see her as human. "Mrs. Whitehorse," Reverend Michaels said gently, "is everything all right?" The old woman ignored him, her dark eyes fixed on Margaret. She crossed the church with surprising speed, her weathered hands reaching out to cup Margaret's face with calloused tenderness. "Little sister," she said in heavily accented English, "you marry the soldier." It wasn't a question. Margaret nodded, unsure what else to do. Mary smiled, showing gaps where teeth used to be. "Good. Good." Then she turned to Elias and spoke rapidly in Cheyenne, her hands moving in signs Margaret didn't understand. Elias's eyes widened slightly, and he responded in the same language, not with his voice, obviously, but with hand signs that flowed like water, like he'd spoken this way his whole life. They conversed for a long moment while Margaret watched, fascinated. She'd never seen Elias communicate so freely, so fluidly. His hands told stories, asked questions, gave answers with a grace that made her realize how much was trapped inside him, how much he had to say that the world never heard because they couldn't be bothered to learn his language. Finally, Mary turned back to Margaret. "This man," she said, pointing at Elias, "he is not broken. His voice is here." She tapped her chest over her heart. "And here." She tapped her forehead. "The spirits speak through him differently, but they speak loud. You listen with more than ears, yes? You listen with eyes, with heart. Then you will hear him." Before Margaret could respond, Mary reached into her shawls and pulled out something wrapped in soft leather. She pressed it into Margaret's hands, closing Margaret's fingers around it firmly. "Protection," the old woman said simply. "For the fight coming. You will need courage like the hawk, seeing far, striking true. You have this already. But remember, the hawk's strength is not in her wings alone, but in knowing when to fly and when to wait. Patience is also a weapon." Then, as quickly as she'd come, Mary Whitehorse shuffled back toward the door. She paused on the threshold, turning to look at them both one last time. "They will try to break you," she said quietly. "All of them. But a thing already broken cannot break again. It can only be remade stronger. This is truth the spirits taught me when I lost everything. May they teach you the same." She disappeared into the wind, leaving the three of them staring after her in silence. Margaret unwrapped the leather carefully. Inside were 2 things, a single hawk feather, banded in brown and white, and a small medicine bag sewn with intricate beadwork. The bag was warm in her palm, as if it held something alive. "What did she say to you?" Margaret asked Elias. "In Cheyenne?" Elias reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small notebook and pencil, always carried, Margaret realized, his only reliable way to communicate with people who didn't know sign language. He wrote quickly and held it up. "She said you saved her grandson 4 years ago, the day of your accident. She's been praying for you ever since. She says the spirits told her you would rise again, but not in the way anyone expects." Margaret felt her throat tighten. She remembered that day, remembered the little boy, maybe 6 years old, who darted into the street chasing a ball just as a wagon came careening around the corner. She'd been on horseback, had reacted without thinking, spurring her mare forward to scoop the child up. She'd gotten him clear just before 2 of Tate's drunken ranch hands, racing their wagon for sport, would have crushed him. They'd fired their guns at her horse, said later it was an accident, that they'd been trying to get the mare under control. But Margaret had seen their eyes, had seen the cold intent. Her father had been getting too close to uncovering their boss's land fraud schemes. Her accident was a warning. Her father's death, 6 months later, was the exclamation point. She'd saved that boy's life and lost the use of her legs in the bargain. Some days she thought it was a fair trade. Other days she wasn't so sure. I didn't know, she whispered, staring at the feather. I never knew his grandmother was still in town. Elias wrote again. She watches over you, says you have more guardians than you know, waiting for the right moment. Margaret wanted to ask what that meant, but exhaustion was suddenly crashing over her like a wave. The confrontation with Tate, the wedding, the strange visit from Mary Whitehorse. It was too much. Her body, always quicker to betray her these days, began to tremble with fatigue. Elias noticed immediately. He tucked his notebook away and knelt beside her wheelchair, his eyes full of concern and a question. Home? Yes, Margaret said gratefully. Please. Reverend Michaels walked them to the door, still shaken, but trying to hide it. Mrs. Ward, he said, testing out her new name. If you need sanctuary, the church is always open. And if you need someone to testify about what happened here today. Thank you, Reverend, Margaret interrupted gently, but testimony won't help us. Tate owns the judge, the sheriff, half the businessmen in town. Words won't stop him. Then what will? The old man asked. Margaret looked up at Elias, at the quiet strength in his weathered face, at the promise of protection in his storm-gray eyes. I don't know yet, she admitted, but I'm going to figure it out, or die trying. Please, Reverend Michaels said fervently, don't choose the latter option. Margaret smiled despite everything. I'll do my best. The ride home was silent, except for the wind and the steady clip-clop of Elias's horse pulling the small wagon he'd borrowed for the occasion. He'd lined the wagon bed with blankets and helped Margaret transfer from her wheelchair with a care that made her ache with something she couldn't name. Not pity. She'd no pity anywhere, had seen it in 1,000 eyes over the past 4 years. This was something else. Respect, maybe. Or the simple acknowledgement that she was a person who deserved dignity. Her land, her father's land, she still thought of it that way, lay 8 miles outside Sweetwater Springs, a sprawling piece of valley floor that had once supported cattle and horses and dreams of building something lasting. Now it was mostly scrub grass and memories, with a small house that needed repairs she couldn't afford and a barn that listed to one side like a drunk leaning into the wind. But it was hers, the last piece of her father that hadn't been taken or destroyed. She'd burn it to the ground herself before she let Randall Tate get his greedy hands on it. Elias helped her down from the wagon with the same careful strength he'd shown in the church, then retrieved her wheelchair and settled her into it. The sun was starting to set, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of orange and purple that hurt to look at because they were so beautiful, and beauty felt dangerous now, like something that could be weaponized against her. Come inside, she said. We should talk. Or, well, I should talk. You can write. We need to figure out what happens now. Elias nodded and followed her up the wooden ramp her father had built in his last days, when it became clear Margaret would never walk again. The ramp was weathered now, in need of fresh paint and probably new boards in places, but it held. Inside, the house was cold. Margaret had let the fire die that morning, too nervous about the wedding to think about practical things. Elias noticed immediately and moved to the fireplace, building up the kindling with efficient movements that spoke of long practice. Margaret wheeled herself to the window and stared out at the land rolling away toward distant mountains. Her land. Her burden. Her responsibility. I should explain, she said quietly, not turning around, why I needed a husband. Why you? She heard the scratch of his pencil on paper, then felt him move to stand beside her chair. He held up his notebook. You don't owe me explanations. I came because I wanted to. Why? The question burst out of her more forcefully than she'd intended. Why would you want to marry someone like me? We barely know each other. You fixed my wheelchair twice and brought me firewood last winter, and that's all we've ever done. Why would you tie yourself to this disaster? Elias's pencil moved across the paper, slower this time, as if he was choosing his words with even more care than usual. When he held up the notebook, Margaret had to lean closer to read in the fading light. Because 4 years ago, I watched you save a child's life and lose everything. I watched your father fight for justice until they murdered him. I watched you refuse to break when anyone else would have crumbled. You asked why I would tie myself to your disaster. I ask, why would I not stand beside someone with that much courage? Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. Not breaking, but opening, like ice splitting in spring thaw. She'd spent 4 years being strong because she had no choice, because the moment she stopped being strong, she'd fall apart completely. But this man, this silent stranger who was now her husband, saw her strength as something worth protecting, rather than something to exploit or pity. "Tate wants this land," she said, forcing herself to focus on practical matters before the emotions overwhelmed her. "My father discovered he's been forging land deeds, claiming territory that belongs to Cheyenne families and small ranchers who can't afford lawyers. Pa was the territorial magistrate. He had the authority and the evidence to bring Tate down. 3 days before he was supposed to present his findings to the territorial governor, he died in what they called a hunting accident." Elias wrote, "But it wasn't." "No." Margaret's hands clenched on her armrests. Pa hadn't gone hunting in 5 years, said his eyes were too bad and his hands too shaky. But somehow the sheriff found him in the woods with his own rifle beside him, shot through the heart. They ruled it accidental discharge. Case closed. The fire Elias had built was catching now, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Margaret continued, her voice flat with the effort of keeping emotion out of it. "The evidence disappeared. Pa's office was ransacked the night he died. Every document, every deed, every piece of proof gone. I tried to tell the territorial marshal, but he said without evidence there was nothing to investigate. Coincidentally, the marshal's son married Tate's daughter 2 months later." Elias's jaw tightened. He wrote rapidly, "So Tate has the law, has the money, has the power. What does he need your land for specifically?" "Water." Margaret wheeled herself closer to the map that hung on the wall near the fireplace, one of the last things her father had left her besides the land itself. She traced the blue line that ran through her property. "Silver Creek runs through here. It's the only reliable water source for 20 miles in any direction. Whoever controls this land controls water rights for half the valley. Tate's been buying up surrounding ranches cheap from families he's driven into debt. But without my water, his land is worthless for cattle. He needs me gone." She turned to look at Elias, expecting to see fear or doubt or the beginning of regret in his eyes. Instead, she saw calculation, the quiet, methodical thinking of someone who'd faced worse odds and survived. He wrote, "How much time do we actually have?" He said 1 week, but men like that don't honor their own deadlines. "A month, maybe." Margaret rubbed her temples, feeling the headache that had been building all day. "I have debts. Medical bills from after the accident, taxes on the land, fees I can't pay. Tate holds most of the notes through various intermediaries. He can call them due whenever he wants. I've been stalling, but..." She trailed off, the hopelessness of it all washing over her again. Elias knelt in front of her wheelchair, his gray eyes intense in the firelight. He wrote something and held it up close to her face. "But now you have help. We'll find a way." "Why do you care?" The question came out sharper than she meant it, laced with 4 years of bitterness and pain. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. You could leave right now, annul this marriage in a week, and nobody would blame you. Why would you stay and fight a battle you can't win?" Elias looked at her for a long moment, then reached up and carefully unpinned the collar of his shirt. Margaret watched, confused, as he pulled the fabric aside to reveal his throat. The scar was massive, a twisted rope of tissue that ran from just below his left ear across his larynx and disappeared beneath his collarbone. It looked like someone had tried to cut his head off and almost succeeded. The wound was old, years healed, but so severe that Margaret felt bile rise in her throat, imagining the pain it must have caused. Elias's hand moved to his notebook. "Battle of Cedar Creek, 1864. Confederate soldier got behind our lines. By the time I killed him, he'd already cut deep enough to destroy my voice forever. The doctor said I should have died, said it was a miracle I survived at all." He paused, and Margaret watched him wrestle with whether to continue. Finally, he wrote more. "For 2 years after the war, I wished I had died. I couldn't talk, couldn't explain myself, couldn't be understood. People looked at me like I was stupid or crazy. I drifted from town to town, taking work nobody else wanted, sleeping in barns, eating scraps. I thought about putting a bullet in my head every single day." Margaret's hand moved without her conscious decision, reaching out to cover his where it rested on his notebook. His skin was warm and rough with calluses. Elias continued writing with his free hand, the words coming slower now. "Then I came to Sweetwater Springs. Took a job mucking stables for a rancher who didn't care if I could talk or not. And one day I saw you." He looked up at her, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "You were in town," he wrote, "arguing with the banker about an extension on your loan. He was talking to you like you were a child, using that voice people use with cripples and idiots. And you looked him dead in the eye and said, 'Mr. Patterson, I may not be able to walk, but I can still count. And your math doesn't add up.' You caught him trying to inflate the interest rate, made him recalculate right there in front of everyone." Margaret remembered that day, remembered the humiliation of having to fight for basic dignity, remembered the way people had stared. Elias's pencil moved again. "You wheeled yourself out of that bank with your head high, and I thought, there's someone who knows what it's like to be underestimated, someone who refuses to be less than she is just because the world wants her to be. I thought, that's someone worth knowing." He flipped to a new page. "So I fixed your wheelchair the first time it broke. Brought you firewood when I saw you were out. Small things, because I didn't know how to do big things. Didn't know if you'd want my help. But I watched you fight day after day, and I thought, if someone like that ever needs someone to fight beside her, I want to be that person, not because you need rescuing, but because warriors should fight together." Margaret's vision blurred with tears she'd sworn she wouldn't cry. "I'm not a warrior. I'm a crippled woman in a chair who can't even protect her own land." Elias shook his head firmly. He wrote in large letters, "You're alive when easier to die. You fight when easier to quit. That's what makes a warrior. Not legs, not voice, not any of the things the world says we're supposed to have. Just the refusal to surrender." Something inside Margaret's chest, something that had been locked tight for 4 years, finally broke open completely. She leaned forward and wrapped her arms around Elias's neck, burying her face in his shoulder. And for the first time since her father's death, she let herself cry. Not the angry tears she'd shed alone in the dark, but the kind of crying that comes from relief, from finding someone who understands, from realizing you're not as alone as you thought. Elias held her carefully, one hand coming up to rest between her shoulder blades, steady and warm. He smelled like leather and wood smoke and something clean she couldn't identify. He didn't try to shush her or tell her it would be okay. He just held her and let her break apart in the safety of his arms, knowing she'd put herself back together when she was ready. When Margaret finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and her eyes were red, and she probably looked like a mess. But Elias's expression held nothing but gentleness. He reached up and carefully wiped her cheeks with his thumb, then smiled that small, transforming smile that made him look younger. "Sorry," Margaret said, her voice hoarse. "I don't usually—" Elias shook his head and wrote, "Don't apologize for being human." They stayed like that for a moment, the fire crackling behind them and the Wyoming wind howling outside, and Margaret felt something shift in her understanding of what this marriage might become. Maybe it had started as a transaction, but it was already becoming something more complicated, something that felt dangerous in an entirely different way than Tate's threats. A sharp knock on the door shattered the moment. Both of them froze. It was full dark now, and nobody came out to Margaret's ranch after nightfall unless they were bringing trouble. Elias rose smoothly to his feet, his hand going to his hip where Margaret now noticed he wore a gun she hadn't seen before, a well-maintained Colt revolver that looked like it had seen significant use. He moved to the door with that same careful, deliberate grace, positioning himself between Margaret and whoever was outside. When he opened the door, his body blocked most of her view, but she heard a familiar voice that made her stomach drop. "Evening, Ward. Is Mrs. Ward receiving visitors?" Sheriff Dutch Calloway pushed past Elias without waiting for an invitation. Not that Elias could have given one verbally anyway. The sheriff was a big man running to fat, with a thick mustache stained yellow from tobacco and eyes that held all the warmth of a snake's. He wore his badge like a shield against decency and his gun like a threat. Behind him came 2 deputies Margaret didn't recognize, both young and hard-looking, the kind of men who enjoyed wearing badges because it gave them license to hurt people legally. "Sheriff," Margaret said coldly, not bothering to hide her hatred. "You have a warrant?" "Now, Margaret, excuse me, Mrs. Ward, why would I need a warrant to check on one of our citizens?" Calloway's smile was all teeth and no humor. Heard you got married today. Came to offer congratulations. In the middle of the night. How thoughtful. Margaret positioned her wheelchair between the sheriff and her bedroom, where she kept her father's old hunting rifle. Not that she could get to it before they could draw their guns, but she felt better knowing it was close. Mayor Tate sends his regards, Calloway continued, walking around her small living room like he owned it. He picked up the carved bird pieces from where Margaret had set them on the table, turning them over in his meaty hands. Said there was some unpleasantness at the church today. Said your new husband here laid hands on Jack Reeves. That true, Ward? Elias stared at him without expression, his arms loose at his sides in a way that Margaret was learning to recognize, the deceptive relaxation of someone ready to move fast if needed. Now, I know you can't answer, Calloway said with false sympathy. So let me tell you how this is going to work. Assault is a serious crime in this territory. Witnesses saw you attack Reeves unprovoked. Could be you spend your wedding night in a cell instead of with your new bride. He was defending me, Margaret said flatly. Reeves destroyed my property. If anyone should be arrested— You have witnesses to that? Calloway interrupted. Besides your husband, who can't testify in court anyway on account of his condition? And besides Reverend Michaels, who I hear has gotten a bit forgetful in his old age. The threat was clear. They'd pressure Michaels to change his story, or simply ignore his testimony. Margaret felt rage building in her chest, hot and dangerous. What do you want, Calloway? The sheriff smiled. Just want to make sure everyone understands the law. See, Mayor Tate is a patient man. He's given you options, given you time. But patience has limits, and when those limits are reached— He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Well, sometimes folks have accidents. Fires start. Livestock wanders off. Water wells get poisoned. Terrible things. Accidents. He set the broken bird pieces down with exaggerated care and turned to face her directly. You're a smart girl, Margaret. Smarter than your daddy, I'd wager. He didn't know when to quit, and look what happened to him. Don't make the same mistake. Something in Margaret snapped. 4 years of fear and grief and swallowed rage came boiling up. And before she could think better of it, she was wheeling forward, her voice sharp as broken glass. Don't you dare speak about my father. You helped murder him, you corrupt son of a— One of the deputies moved, faster than Margaret expected, his hand raised to strike her. She saw it coming, but couldn't move fast enough to avoid it, frozen in her chair like the cripple they all saw when they looked at her. The blow never landed. Elias was there, his hand catching the deputy's wrist in midair with a grip that made the younger man cry out in pain. Then Elias moved, 3 precise motions so fast Margaret almost couldn't track them. He twisted the deputy's arm behind his back, swept his legs out from under him, and drove him face first into the floor hard enough to bounce. The second deputy went for his gun. Elias's boot caught him in the stomach, doubling him over. Then Elias's elbow came down on the back of his neck and he went down like a felled tree. The entire thing took maybe 3 seconds. Sheriff Calloway's hand was on his own gun now, halfway drawn, his face purple with shock and rage. But Elias's Colt was already out, cocked and pointed directly at the sheriff's forehead, steady as stone. The room went very, very quiet. You— Calloway started, but whatever he was going to say died when he saw Elias's eyes. There was no anger there, no fear, no emotion at all. Just the cold certainty of someone who'd killed before and would do it again without hesitation if necessary. Margaret found her voice, somehow keeping it steady. Sheriff Calloway, it appears your deputies just attempted to assault me in my own home. My husband defended me. That's legal under territorial law. Now, unless you want to add breaking and entering and attempted assault to the charges I'll be filing with the territorial marshal, I suggest you collect your men and leave. You can't, Calloway sputtered. Can't what? Defend myself? Report crimes? I may be a cripple, Sheriff, but I'm not stupid, and I'm not powerless. Not anymore. She looked at Elias. At the gun he held so steady it might have been carved from stone. I have a husband now. A husband who, despite not being able to speak, seems quite capable of making his point clear. Wouldn't you agree? Calloway's face went through several shades of red and purple before settling on a sick gray. Slowly, carefully, he removed his hand from his gun and held both hands up. You're making a mistake, girl. A big one. No, Margaret said quietly. The mistake was yours. You thought I was alone. You thought I was helpless. You were wrong on both counts. Elias made a gesture with his gun. Get out. The message was clear even without words. The two deputies struggled to their feet, both groaning, one with blood streaming from his nose. Calloway backed toward the door, his eyes never leaving Elias's gun. Mayor Tate will hear about this. I'm counting on it, Margaret said. Tell him next time he wants to threaten me, he should have the courage to come himself instead of sending lackeys. When they were gone, the sound of their horses fading into the night, Elias finally lowered his gun. His hand was shaking now, Margaret noticed. Not from fear, but from adrenaline crash, from the effort of holding himself back from doing something worse. He sank into the chair near the fire and put his head in his hands, the gun dangling from his fingers. Margaret wheeled over quickly and took the Colt from him, setting it on the table, then reached for his hands. They were ice cold despite the warmth of the room. Hey, she said softly. Elias, look at me. He raised his head, and she saw the ghosts in his eyes, memories of war, of violence, of things he'd done that he couldn't undo. She understood then what it had cost him to pull that gun, to stand ready to kill again after whatever he'd done in the war had destroyed his voice and left him haunted. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for protecting me. He shook his head and reached for his notebook with trembling hands. I shouldn't have drawn on him, made things worse. Now they'll come back with more men, more guns. They were always going to come back with more men and guns, Margaret said firmly. At least now they know we'll fight, that we're not going to roll over and let them take everything. Elias wrote, I could have killed him. Was going to. Wanted to. But you didn't. Margaret squeezed his hands. You showed restraint. You did exactly what needed to be done and nothing more. That's not a failure. That's control. He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, and she saw the question in them. What kind of man does that make me? What kind of monster can kill so easily? The kind who survives, Margaret answered the unspoken question. The kind who protects the people he cares about. There's no shame in that. They sat together in silence for a long time, listening to the fire crackle and the wind outside. Margaret's mind was racing, trying to think through their options. Calloway would go straight to Tate. Tate would escalate. They had days, maybe hours, before something worse happened. We need help, she said finally. Allies, people who will stand with us against Tate. Elias nodded and wrote, The Cheyenne families your father tried to help. They remember. You think they'd risk going against Tate? They have even less protection than I do. They have numbers, and they have long memories of justice denied. Elias flipped the page. Your father stood for them when no one else would. Maybe it's time to call in that debt. Margaret thought about Mary Whitehorse's words at the church, about having more guardians than she knew. It's dangerous. If Tate finds out they're helping us, Elias wrote, everything is dangerous now. We fight together or die separately. He was right. They'd crossed a line tonight that couldn't be uncrossed. Elias had pulled a gun on the sheriff. Margaret had threatened to file charges against the mayor's men. There was no backing down, no negotiating, no way out except through. Tomorrow, Margaret said, making the decision as she spoke. Tomorrow we ride out to the Cheyenne camp. We talk to the families my father helped. We see who'll stand with us. Elias nodded, then wrote something else. Tonight we rest. You're exhausted. When did you last eat? Margaret tried to remember and couldn't. This morning, maybe? Before the wedding? He shook his head in exasperation and stood, moving to her small kitchen area. She watched in fascination as he efficiently located bread, cheese, and dried meat, putting together a simple meal with the confidence of someone who'd cooked for himself for a long time. He set the food in front of her with a gesture that clearly meant, eat. Bossy, Margaret said, but she picked up the bread gratefully. Her hands were shaking, shock catching up with her now that the immediate danger had passed. She'd come so close to being hit. Would have been, if Elias hadn't moved so fast. While she ate, Elias moved around her small house, checking the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. He moved quietly, efficiently, like he was setting up a military camp. When he was satisfied, he returned to sit across from her, watching her eat with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable but somehow didn't. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" she asked, around a mouthful of bread. He reached for his notebook. "War teaches you fast or kills you." "I learned fast." "Were you infantry? Cavalry?" "Scout." He wrote the words slowly, like it brought back memories he didn't want to revisit. Went ahead of the main force, gathered intelligence, sometimes did things that needed doing quietly. Margaret understood what he wasn't saying. Scouts didn't just gather intelligence. They sabotaged enemy camps, assassinated officers, did the dirty work that regular soldiers couldn't. No wonder he moved so quietly, so purposefully. No wonder violence came to him so easily. "You must think I'm foolish," she said quietly, "for standing up to Tate, for not just selling and moving somewhere safe." Elias's pencil moved quickly. "I think you're the bravest person I've ever met. Foolish would be giving up. Brave is fighting even when you know you might lose." "We're going to lose," Margaret said, the words coming out flat and certain. "Tate has too much power, too many men, too much money. Even if we get the Cheyenne families on our side, even if we somehow find evidence of his crimes, the law is on his side. The judges, the marshals, the territorial government, they're all bought and paid for. How do we fight that?" Elias wrote for a long time, filling an entire page before showing it to her. "My unit in the war, we had a saying, you can't fight an army head-on when you're outnumbered, so you make them fight on your terms instead. We didn't win battles by being stronger. We won by being smarter, faster, more willing to do what needed doing. Tate expects you to fight fair, to follow rules he controls. What if you don't? What if you fight the way he fights, dirty, unpredictable, willing to hit where it hurts?" Margaret stared at the words, her mind working. "You're talking about guerrilla tactics. My father tried to fight legally, and they killed him. You're saying we should fight illegally?" "I'm saying we should fight to win," Elias wrote. "Whatever that takes." It was a dangerous idea. It was also the first thing anyone had suggested that didn't sound like a slow march toward defeat. Margaret's father had believed in justice, in the law, in doing things the right way. And he died for those beliefs. Maybe it was time to stop playing by rules that only protected the people who already had power. "We'd need proof," she said slowly, thinking it through. "Proof of the land fraud, the forged deeds, everything Tate's done. But all of my father's evidence was destroyed." Elias's eyes gleamed in the firelight. He wrote, "Was it? Or was it just moved somewhere we haven't looked yet?" "What do you mean?" "If Tate's people ransacked your father's office, where would they have taken the documents? They couldn't destroy everything. Some of those deeds were official territorial records. They had to replace them with forgeries, which means the originals still exist somewhere." Margaret felt a spark of hope kindle in her chest. The Territorial Land Office, in Cheyenne, that's where all the original deeds are supposed to be filed. "And if Tate's been forging documents for years, there would be discrepancies," Elias wrote quickly, his excitement showing in the messier handwriting. "Original signatures that don't match the new ones. Dates that don't align. We'd need someone who knows what to look for, someone who can compare the documents without Tate knowing. Someone like a territorial magistrate." Margaret's mind was racing now. "My father had a colleague, Judge Abernathy in Laramie. They worked together for years. Pa trusted him completely. If we could get him to examine the land office records..." Elias nodded eagerly and wrote, "How far is Laramie?" 3 days hard ride, maybe 4 with..." She gestured at her wheelchair, at the reality of her limitations. But Elias was already writing, "Wagon can make it in 5 days. We take back roads, avoid main routes where Tate's men might watch. We're already married, so you traveling with me won't raise questions. We go to Laramie, talk to the judge, get him to investigate the land office. If we find proof, we can take it to the territorial governor," Margaret finished. "Bypass all of Tate's local connections. Go straight to the top." They looked at each other across the table, the plan taking shape between them like a living thing. It was dangerous. It was probably impossible. But it was something which was more than Margaret had had since her father died. "We'd have to leave soon," she said, "before Tate realizes what we're doing." Elias wrote, "Tomorrow night. We spend tomorrow gathering supplies, talking to the Cheyenne families, making preparations. Anyone watching will think we're just settling into married life. Then we leave after dark, head north. By the time Tate realizes we're gone, we'll be halfway to Laramie. He'll send men after us. Probably. Elias's expression was grim, which is why we don't take the main road, and why we make sure we're ready to fight if they catch us. Margaret felt fear and excitement warring in her chest. This was it, the moment she'd been waiting for since her father's death. The chance to actually fight back, to do something more than just survive day to day. It might get her killed. It probably would get her killed. But at least she'd die trying, which was better than slowly drowning in debt and threats while Tate circled like a shark. Okay, she said. We do it. Tomorrow we prepare. Tomorrow night we ride. Elias reached across the table and took her hand, squeezing it firmly. When she met his eyes, she saw the same determination she felt, the same willingness to risk everything for a chance at justice. They were going to fight, and maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The rest of the night passed in careful planning. Elias made notes on everything they'd need: supplies, weapons, routes, contingencies. Margaret sketched out what she remembered of the land office records from when she'd helped her father, trying to recall details that might help them prove fraud. They worked together in comfortable silence, occasionally writing notes back and forth, building trust with every shared idea. Around midnight, exhaustion finally caught up with Margaret. She'd been running on adrenaline and fear for so long that when it finally drained away, she felt hollowed out, barely able to keep her eyes open. I should sleep, she said, her voice slurring slightly. You can take my father's room. It's small, but the bed's decent. Elias shook his head and wrote, I'll sleep out here. Keep watch in case they come back. You need rest too. I'll rest. But I'll rest where I can see the door. His expression was gentle but firm. Let me do this. Please. Margaret was too tired to argue. She wheeled herself to her small bedroom, changed into a nightgown with fumbling fingers, and transferred to her bed. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was the thin line of firelight under her door and the shadow of Elias moving past it, awake, alert, standing guard. For the first time in 4 years, Margaret Hale, now Margaret Ward, fell asleep feeling safe. She woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar sounds of someone else moving around her house. Sunlight streamed through her bedroom window, bright and merciless, telling her she'd slept far later than usual. Margaret pulled herself upright with practiced efficiency, transferring to her wheelchair and making herself presentable as quickly as her sleep-fogged mind would allow. When she wheeled into the main room, she found Elias at her stove, cooking breakfast with the same quiet competence he'd shown the night before. He'd already stoked the fire, swept the floor, and apparently fed her 2 chickens, judging by the fresh eggs sitting on the counter. He turned when he heard her wheels and offered that small smile that transformed his scarred face. He'd written a note and propped it against her coffee cup. Good morning, Mrs. Ward. Hope you don't mind. I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage basics. Margaret felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something she didn't have a name for yet. You didn't have to do all this. Elias just shrugged and turned back to the bacon, and Margaret realized this was who he was. Someone who showed care through action rather than words, who expressed affection through coffee made just strong enough, and eggs cooked until the yolk was still soft because he'd noticed that's how she liked them at the church social 3 months ago. They ate together in comfortable silence, the morning light painting everything gold and gentle. It felt domestic in a way Margaret hadn't experienced since before her mother died when she was 12. She'd forgotten what it was like to share breakfast with someone, to have another person's presence fill the empty spaces of her house with warmth and purpose. We should head out soon, Margaret said, draining her coffee. The Cheyenne camp is about 6 miles east, near the old mission ruins. Mary Whitehorse will be there. She can help us talk to the others. Elias nodded and began clearing the dishes, but Margaret caught his hand. Before we go, I need to know something. Last night, when you drew on Calloway, you were ready to kill him. I could see it in your eyes. If he'd moved wrong, if he'd gone for his gun. She trailed off, searching his face. Would you have done it? Would you have killed a sheriff, knowing it would make us fugitives, knowing we'd have to run forever. Elias looked at her for a long moment, then reached for his notebook. His pencil moved slowly, each word deliberate. I spent 3 years in the war killing men who were trying to kill me. Some were soldiers, some were civilians caught in the wrong place. Some were boys younger than me who'd been conscripted and didn't want to fight. I killed them all because that's what you do in war. You kill or you die. After Cedar Creek, after I lost my voice, I swore I'd never kill again unless I had no other choice. But last night, when that deputy raised his hand to strike you, I would have killed all 3 of them without hesitation. Does that make me a monster? Maybe. But I've learned to live with being a monster if it means protecting the people I care about. Margaret read the words twice, feeling the weight of them, the brutal honesty. She should have been frightened, should have questioned whether she'd made a terrible mistake marrying a man who could kill so easily. Instead, she felt safer than she had in years. I don't think you're a monster, she said quietly. I think you're a survivor who's been through hell and came out the other side still trying to be good. That's not monstrous. That's human. Elias's hand covered hers where it rested on his notebook, and they stayed like that for a heartbeat, connected by understanding that went deeper than words. Then he squeezed gently and stood, moving to prepare the wagon for their journey. The ride to the Cheyenne camp was rougher than Margaret had anticipated. Her wheelchair was secured in the wagon bed, and Elias had fashioned a kind of cushioned seat for her that helped absorb the worst of the jolts, but every rut and rock still sent pain shooting through her damaged spine. She bit her lip and endured, refusing to let him see how much it hurt. She'd asked for this. She'd chosen to fight. She wouldn't complain about the cost. Elias seemed to sense her discomfort anyway. He slowed the horses to an easier pace and took detours around the worst of the terrain, adding time to their journey but sparing her body. When they stopped to rest the animals, he helped her into her wheelchair without comment and handed her a canteen without being asked. The old mission ruins appeared on the horizon around midday, crumbling adobe walls that had once been a Spanish mission. Back before this territory had been Mexican, before it had been American, back when it had just been land that people fought and died over without bothering to change its essential nature. The Cheyenne had made camp in the shelter of those walls, their teepees rising like ghosts against the endless Wyoming sky. As they approached, children scattered to alert the adults. Margaret saw faces appear at teepee entrances, mostly women and old men, she noticed. The younger men were probably out hunting or working in town, trying to scrape together money and dignity in a world that wanted to give them neither. Mary Whitehorse emerged from one of the larger teepees, her weathered face breaking into a smile when she saw them. She spoke rapidly in Cheyenne, gesturing them forward, and several younger women hurried over to help Margaret down from the wagon. "Little sister," Mary said, taking Margaret's hands in her own, "you come. Good. We have been waiting." "Waiting for what?" Margaret asked. "For you to be ready to fight." Mary's eyes were sharp and knowing. "Your father fought for us when no one else would. Now we fight for you. But you had to be ready first, had to have your warrior beside you." She looked at Elias with approval. "The silent one who speaks with his hands and his heart. Good choice." She led them to the center of the camp, where a fire pit had been prepared. Women brought food, cornbread and dried meat, and something that smelled like sage tea. Men began to gather, emerging from teepees and work areas, their faces curious and guarded. An old man with a face like carved mahogany approached, leaning heavily on a walking stick. His eyes were clouded with age, but his bearing was straight and proud. Mary spoke to him in rapid Cheyenne, gesturing to Margaret and Elias. The old man nodded slowly, then sat by the fire and gestured for them to join him. "This is Thomas Running Bear," Mary said. "He is our elder. He will listen to what you have to say." Margaret wheeled herself closer to the fire, feeling the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on her. Elias stood behind her wheelchair, his presence solid and reassuring. She took a breath and began to speak. "My father was Magistrate Samuel Hale. Some of you knew him. He tried to help your families when Mayor Tate started stealing your land through forged deeds and false claims. He was gathering evidence to present to the territorial governor when he was murdered." Her voice caught slightly on the last word, but she pushed through. "They made it look like an accident. They destroyed his evidence. They thought that would be the end of it, but I'm still here, and I'm not going to let his death mean nothing. Thomas Running Bear listened without expression, his clouded eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder. When she finished, he spoke in Cheyenne, his voice like gravel grinding. Mary translated. He says your father was a good man, one of the few white men who saw us as people instead of problems. When Tate's men came to claim Spotted Hawk's land, your father stood in front of their guns and said, "You will not take this land. It belongs to this family by legal treaty." The men laughed and said treaties with Indians weren't worth the paper they were written on. Your father said, "Then I will make sure every newspaper in the territory knows the territorial government breaks its own laws." The men left. Spotted Hawk kept his land for 3 more months until your father died. Then the men came back. Now Spotted Hawk is dead too, and his family lives here, with nothing. Margaret felt rage building in her chest again, the familiar burn that had kept her alive through 4 years of grief. I want to stop Tate. I want to make him pay for what he's done to all of us. But I can't do it alone. I need allies. I need people willing to stand up and say what was done to them. People willing to risk Tate's anger for a chance at justice. Thomas spoke again, longer this time, his hands moving in emphatic gestures. Mary listened carefully before translating. He says justice is a white man's word for revenge that feels righteous. He says his people have been promised justice many times, and every time it has been a lie. Treaties were justice until they were broken. Reservations were justice until they became prisons. Schools were justice until they became places where children forgot their language and their spirits. Why should he believe this time will be different? The question hung in the air, heavy with history and pain. Margaret had no easy answer. She couldn't promise that the system would work this time when it had failed these people over and over again. She couldn't guarantee that fighting Tate wouldn't just bring more suffering. Elias moved then, stepping around Margaret's wheelchair to stand before Thomas Running Bear. He knelt in the dirt and began to sign in Cheyenne Sign Language, his hands moving with fluid grace. Margaret watched, transfixed, as a conversation unfolded that she couldn't fully understand but could feel the emotional weight of. Thomas's expression changed as Elias signed, his clouded eyes focusing with sudden intensity. He responded with his own hand signs, quick and sharp, asking questions. Elias answered with that same patient honesty he'd shown Margaret the night before, holding nothing back. The conversation went on for several minutes while the rest of the camp watched in silence. Finally, Thomas nodded slowly and spoke aloud. Mary's translation was soft. The Silent One says he cannot promise justice. He can only promise that if we fight together, we fight as warriors, not as victims begging for mercy. He says white men like Tate understand only strength, not righteousness. So we must show them strength they cannot ignore. He says he will stand with us until death or victory, and he does not much care which comes first, as long as it comes with honor. Thomas studied Elias for a long moment, then reached out and placed his hand on Elias's shoulder in what was clearly a gesture of acceptance. He spoke again, and this time his voice held something that might have been approval. He says you speak truth, Mary translated. He says he sees the warrior in you, the one who has faced death and learned not to fear it. He says this is the kind of man who can teach others not to fear. He will help you. We will help you. Relief flooded through Margaret so intensely she felt dizzy with it. Thank you so much. Do not thank us yet, Thomas said through Mary. First we must hear your plan. If it is foolish, we will not follow you to meaningless death. But if it is wise, if there is a chance to strike at the man who has taken so much from us, then yes, we will fight. Margaret looked at Elias, who gave her an encouraging nod. Together, they laid out their plan. The journey to Laramie, the meeting with Judge Abernathy, the search for evidence in the Territorial Land Office. As they talked, more people gathered around the fire. Margaret saw recognition in some faces, remembered fragments of the families her father had tried to help. A woman whose husband had been killed in a suspicious riding accident after refusing to sell his land. A young man who'd been beaten by Tate's deputies for the crime of being in town after dark. An old woman whose granddaughter had been driven off her property at gunpoint. Each story was a variation on the same theme, Tate taking what he wanted and crushing anyone who stood in his way. The law was supposed to protect people. Instead, it had become a weapon wielded by the powerful against the powerless. When Margaret and Elias finished explaining their plan, Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice carrying across the camp. "We have two who will go with you to Laramie," Mary translated. "Riders who know the back trails, who can scout ahead and watch for Tate's men. You will not travel alone and unprotected." "We can't ask you to risk—" Margaret started, but Thomas cut her off with a sharp gesture. "You do not ask. We offer. There is a difference." His clouded eyes found hers with unsettling accuracy. "Your father stood alone when he fought for us. He died alone. You will not be alone. This we promise." Two young men stepped forward from the crowd. Brothers, Margaret guessed, with the same sharp features and straight black hair. They were lean and hard-muscled, wearing a mix of traditional and white clothing, with rifles slung across their backs and knives at their belts. "This is Joseph and Marcus Broken Lance," Mary said. "They are good scouts, good fighters. They will keep you safe." Joseph, the older of the two, spoke in careful English. "We knew your father, Mrs. Ward. He testified for our grandfather when Tate tried to claim our family's land, said our treaty rights were valid under territorial law. The judge, he was Tate's man, didn't listen, but your father tried. That means something to us." "We'll leave tonight," Marcus added, his English slightly more accented than his brother's. "Travel under darkness, harder for Tate's men to track us. We know places to hide during the day, places they won't think to look." Margaret felt her throat tighten with gratitude and fear. These men were risking their lives for her, for the memory of her father, for the slim chance that this time justice might actually mean something. If they were caught helping her, Tate would kill them without hesitation. Yet they stepped forward anyway, offering their strength and their skill because honor demanded it. "Thank you," she said, and wished the words were bigger, more adequate to express what she felt. The rest of the afternoon was spent in preparation. The Broken Lance brothers showed Elias the routes they would take, marking them on a rough map drawn in the dirt. They discussed contingencies, escape routes, what to do if they were discovered or cornered. Margaret watched Elias transform as they planned, the quiet cowboy disappearing, replaced by the soldier he'd been, the scout who'd survived 3 years of war through careful preparation and controlled violence. The women of the camp helped Margaret prepare her portion of supplies, packing food that would keep, showing her how to make the wheelchair more secure in the wagon so it wouldn't shift and throw her during rough travel. Mary gave her a small leather pouch filled with herbs and showed her how to make tea that would help with the pain she knew Margaret suffered but never spoke about. "The body remembers trauma," Mary said as she worked, "even when the mind tries to forget. You carry your injury with you every moment. This tea will help the pain, but it will also help you stay alert. You cannot fight if pain makes you weak." "I've learned to live with pain," Margaret said. "Living with it is not the same as managing it." Mary's hands were gentle but firm as she tied the pouch closed. A warrior acknowledges weakness so she can compensate for it. Only a fool pretends to be invincible. Margaret accepted the wisdom and the herbs with equal gratitude. She was learning that the Cheyenne understood survival in ways that white society had forgotten or never known. They'd had to, in order to endure everything that had been done to them. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that hurt to look at, Thomas Running Bear called everyone together one more time. He spoke in Cheyenne, his voice carrying across the camp with surprising strength for someone so old. Mary stood beside Margaret, translating in low tones. "He's telling them about your journey," Mary said. "He's saying that this fight is not just for your land or your father's memory. It is for all of us who have been pushed aside, stolen from, treated as less than human. He's saying that if you succeed, it will prove that the law can still work for people without power. And if you fail, at least you will have failed while fighting, which is better than dying slowly from despair." Thomas raised his walking stick high, and the camp erupted in a cry that made Margaret's skin prickle with something primal and fierce. It was a war cry, she realized, the sound of people who'd been beaten down and suppressed, deciding that enough was finally enough. Elias stood beside her wheelchair, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, and when Margaret looked up at him, she saw tears on his scarred face, catching the last light of day. He signed something quickly to Joseph Broken Lance, who translated for her. He says he has never had a tribe before, never had people who would fight beside him. He says it is an honor he does not deserve but will try to be worthy of. Joseph smiled, rare and quick. Tell your husband that the tribe chooses its warriors. He did not need to deserve it. He only needed to be willing. As darkness fell, they made their final preparations. The wagon was packed with supplies and weapons. Margaret's wheelchair was secured with rope and leather straps that would keep it from shifting. Elias checked the horses carefully, making sure they were rested and fed. The Broken Lance brothers readied their own mounts, tough, wiry ponies that could cover ground quickly and quietly. Before they left, Mary pulled Margaret aside one more time. In the darkness, illuminated only by the fire, the old woman looked ancient and ageless all at once, like she carried knowledge that went back before history could remember. "You love him already," Mary said. It wasn't a question. Margaret opened her mouth to deny it, then stopped. Did she love Elias? She barely knew him. They'd been married less than 24 hours. Love was supposed to take time, wasn't it? But when she thought about the way he'd stood between her and violence, the way he'd knelt to put himself at her level, the way he'd signed with such passion to Thomas about fighting with honor. Yes, she realized with a start. Yes, she loved him, or at least loved the man she was beginning to know. The warrior with gentle hands and a scarred throat who saw her as whole when the world saw her as broken. "I do," she admitted, the words feeling strange and right all at once. "Is that foolish? To love someone so quickly?" "Love is always foolish," Mary said with a smile. "But it is also always necessary. You think you fight for your father's memory, for justice, for your land, but you also fight because now you have something to fight for besides survival. You have someone who sees you. That makes all the difference." She pressed something into Margaret's palm, a small carved stone that felt warm despite the cold air. "For protection, for courage, for reminding you that you are stronger than you know." Then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness like smoke, and Elias was there to help Margaret into the wagon. Joseph and Marcus were already mounted, their rifles across their saddles, their faces set with determination. "Ready?" Elias's note said when he held it up for her to read in the dim light. Margaret looked at the camp behind them, at the people who'd offered their help despite having so little themselves. She looked at the vast Wyoming darkness ahead, full of danger and possibility in equal measure. She looked at Elias, solid and sure beside her, ready to face whatever came. "Ready," she said. They rode out into the night, 4 people against an empire of corruption, carrying nothing but hope and determination and the desperate belief that sometimes the right fight was worth fighting even when you knew you'd probably lose. The first hours passed in tense silence. Joseph and Marcus ranged ahead, scouting the trail, while Elias drove the wagon with careful attention to every sound and shadow. Margaret sat beside him, one hand clutching the small stone Mary had given her, the other resting near the rifle they'd placed within her reach. The moon was a silver sliver, giving just enough light to see the trail without making them visible from a distance. They traveled slowly, avoiding the main road, following paths that wound through rocky terrain and stands of pine that would hide them from casual observation. Every time they heard something, a nightbird's cry, a coyote's howl, the snap of a branch, they froze, waiting to see if it was natural or if Tate's men had found them already. Around midnight, Marcus rode back to the wagon, his pony barely making a sound on the soft earth. He signed something to Elias, who nodded and brought the wagon to a halt. "What is it?" Margaret whispered. Marcus swung down from his pony, his voice equally quiet. "There's a creek about a mile ahead. Good place to rest the horses, refill the water barrels. Joseph's checking to make sure it's clear." They waited in the darkness, Margaret's heart hammering against her ribs. This was real now. They were fugitives, essentially, running from the law even though they were the ones trying to uphold it. If Calloway caught them, he'd arrest Elias for assault. Might arrest her too for conspiracy. They'd be thrown in Tate's jail, and that would be the end of everything. A bird call sounded from up ahead, 3 short notes. Marcus relaxed. Joseph's signal, all clear. They moved forward carefully until they reached the creek, a thin ribbon of water that caught the moonlight like liquid mercury. While Elias and Marcus tended the horses, Joseph appeared out of the shadows to speak with Margaret. "We're making good time," he said, crouching beside her wheelchair. "At this pace, we'll reach the canyon country by dawn. We can hide there during the day, sleep in shifts, travel again tomorrow night." Have you seen any sign of pursuit? Not yet, but they'll come. Men like Tate don't let challenges go unanswered. Joseph's face was serious in the dim light. When they do come, we'll need to be ready to fight, or run. You should know, if it comes to fighting, Marcus and I won't hesitate to kill. We've done it before. Not proud of it, but won't apologize for it either. Margaret thought about Elias's words from the night before, about being a monster if that's what protecting people required. I understand, she said. Do what you need to do to keep us all alive. Joseph nodded, respect flickering in his eyes. Your father was like that too, practical when he needed to be. He understood that sometimes survival doesn't leave room for being civilized. He was murdered for it. He was. But he died knowing he'd fought for something that mattered. That's more than most men can say. Joseph stood, his hand resting on the rifle at his side. Get some rest while you can, Mrs. Ward. Once we start moving again, there won't be much time for sleeping. But sleep was impossible. Margaret's mind raced with everything that could go wrong, every way this plan could fail and get them all killed. She thought about her father, about whether he'd be proud of what she was doing or horrified that she was risking not just her own life but the lives of others. She thought about Elias, this man she'd married out of desperation, who'd somehow become the most important person in her world in less than 2 days. Elias returned from checking the wagon and found her staring at the creek, lost in thought. He settled beside her wheelchair, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and wrote a quick note. Afraid? Terrified, Margaret admitted. You? He wrote, always. Fear keeps you sharp, makes you careful. The soldiers who weren't afraid were the ones who died first because they took stupid risks. How do you live with being afraid all the time? His pencil moved slowly. You don't live with it. You live through it. Big difference. Living with fear means letting it control you. Living through it means acknowledging it exists and doing what needs doing anyway. Margaret turned to look at him, at the way the faint moonlight caught the sharp planes of his face, the scar on his throat that should have killed him, but didn't. Do you ever wish things had been different? That you'd never gone to war, never got wounded, never lost your voice? Elias thought for a long moment, then wrote, If I'd never gone to war, I wouldn't have become who I am. If I hadn't lost my voice, I wouldn't have learned to see and hear things I missed before. If I'd stayed wherever I came from, and honestly I barely remember it now, I wouldn't have ended up in Sweetwater Springs, wouldn't have seen you in that bank, standing up to men who wanted you to be small, wouldn't be here now fighting beside you. So, no, I don't wish things were different. This is the only path that led me to you, and that makes it the right path. Margaret's vision blurred with tears she refused to shed. She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his, feeling the calluses and scars that told stories he couldn't speak aloud. I'm glad you're here, she whispered. I'm glad it's you. He squeezed her hand, and they sat together in the darkness, listening to water run over stones and horses shuffle in the grass, stealing a moment of peace before the violence they both knew was coming. Marcus's low whistle broke the moment. They looked up to see him standing alert, his hand on his rifle, staring back the way they'd come. Joseph appeared instantly, moving with that eerie silence Margaret was coming to associate with both brothers. What is it? Elias wrote quickly, showing the note to Joseph. Thought I heard something, probably nothing, but Joseph trailed off, his eyes scanning the darkness. We should move. Now. They packed up quickly and quietly, erasing what traces of their presence they could. Margaret's heart was racing again as Elias lifted her into the wagon, his movements efficient despite the darkness. The horses sensed the tension and shifted nervously as Marcus and Joseph mounted their ponies. They'd barely started moving when Margaret heard it too, the distant sound of hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast, coming from the direction of Sweetwater Springs. How many? She whispered. Joseph held up 5 fingers, then 6, then 7. Too many to fight if they were Tate's men. Their only chance was to run and hide. The canyon, Marcus said urgently. We can lose them in the rocks if we get there first. Elias snapped the reins, urging the horses faster, and the wagon lurched forward. Margaret grabbed the side rail to steady herself, feeling every jolt and bounce as they raced through the darkness. Behind them, the hoofbeats grew louder, closer. Someone shouted, too far away to make out words, but the intent was clear. They'd been spotted. The canyon country rose ahead of them like a darker shadow against the dark sky. Margaret saw Joseph and Marcus split off, flanking them, their rifles ready. If the pursuit caught up before they reached cover, the brothers would have to slow them down, buy time with bullets and blood. A gunshot cracked through the night. Margaret flinched, but the bullet went wide, hitting rocks somewhere to their left. Return fire came from Marcus, 3 quick shots, measured and controlled. A horse screamed, and the pursuing hoofbeats faltered for a moment. "They're not trying to kill us," Joseph called out, his voice tight. "They're trying to disable the wagon. Tate wants you alive." That was somehow worse. Margaret knew what Tate would do if he caught them, knew the kind of persuasion he'd use, the threats he'd make, the pain he'd inflict to get what he wanted. Death would almost be kinder. The wagon hit a rut and bounced so hard Margaret bit her tongue, tasting blood. Elias fought to keep control, his hand steady on the reins even as more gunfire erupted behind them. She heard a bullet punch through the canvas cover of the wagon, far too close. Then they were in the canyon, walls of stone rising on either side, narrowing the path and forcing their pursuers into a single-file approach. Joseph and Marcus immediately took positions on higher ground, using the rocks for cover, laying down suppressing fire that echoed like thunder in the confined space. Elias drove the wagon deeper into the canyon, following a path that seemed to exist only in his mind, or perhaps in knowledge shared by the Broken Lance brothers. Finally, he pulled the horses into a narrow side ravine barely wide enough for the wagon, hidden from the main canyon by an overhang of rock. He jumped down and immediately came to Margaret, pulling her into her wheelchair with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline. He pressed his rifle into her hands, his eyes fierce in the darkness, and she understood. If they came, she would have to fight too. There was no room for helplessness here, no space for being the crippled girl who needed protecting. She was a warrior now, whether she felt like one or not. The gunfire continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Margaret heard men shouting, heard horses scrambling on loose rock, heard the sharp crack of rifles and the heavier boom of shotguns. She gripped her own rifle and waited, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Then silence fell, sudden and absolute. They waited, barely breathing, straining to hear anything that would tell them what had happened. Had Joseph and Marcus driven them off? Been captured? Been killed? A bird call sounded. 3 short notes, Joseph's all-clear signal. Margaret sagged with relief so intense she felt dizzy. The brothers appeared minutes later, their faces grim but triumphant. Joseph had blood on his sleeve, but when Margaret gasped, he waved it off. "Grazed. I'm fine. But we need to keep moving. I counted 8 men, maybe 9. We hit 2, maybe killed 1. The rest pulled back, but they'll regroup and come at us again." "They know where we're headed now," Marcus added. "They'll send word ahead, try to cut us off before we reach Laramie." Elias wrote quickly. "Can we still make it?" Joseph and Marcus exchanged a look, having one of those silent conversations that siblings sometimes share. Finally, Joseph nodded. "Maybe. If we're smart and fast and lucky, we'll need all 3. They moved deeper into the canyon as dawn began to paint the eastern sky, pink and gold. Margaret watched the light creep across the rocks and thought about her father, about whether he'd felt this same mixture of fear and determination when he'd stood against Tate. She thought about all the people who'd given up, who'd sold their land and moved away rather than fight. She couldn't blame them. Fighting was exhausting and terrifying and probably futile. But as she looked at Elias guiding the horses through impossible terrain, at Joseph and Marcus keeping watch with rifles ready, at the slowly brightening sky that promised a new day, she thought maybe, just maybe, some things were worth the fight even if you lost. Maybe the fighting itself was the point. Maybe refusing to give up was its own kind of victory. They would reach Laramie or die trying, and either way, Margaret Ward would meet her fate on her own terms, with her eyes open and her spine straight, exactly the way her father had taught her. The canyon walls closed in around them like the jaws of some ancient stone beast as full daylight arrived. They found a cave tucked into the rock face, shallow but deep enough to hide the wagon and horses from anyone passing on the main trail below. Joseph and Marcus took first watch while Elias helped Margaret down from the wagon, his hands gentle despite the exhaustion she could see etched into every line of his face. She wanted to tell him to rest, that she could manage on her own, but the truth was she couldn't. Her body was screaming from hours of being jolted in the wagon, pain radiating from her damaged spine in waves that made her nauseous. She took the tea Mary had given her, mixing it with water from their canteen, forcing herself to drink even though it tasted like dirt and bitterness. "How bad?" Elias wrote, watching her face too carefully. "Manageable," Margaret lied, then saw his expression and relented. "Bad, but not as bad as it could be. I'll survive." He knelt beside her wheelchair and carefully began massaging her legs. Not because they could feel it, but because the massage helped blood flow, prevented sores, kept the muscles from atrophying completely. Her father's doctor had taught her this in the early days after the accident, back when she'd still hoped feeling might return. It hadn't, but the routine remained necessary. Margaret watched Elias's scarred hands work with practiced efficiency and felt something break open in her chest. This man, who'd known her for barely 3 days, was tending to her body with more care than most people showed their own. He hadn't signed up for this, for a wife who needed constant accommodation, whose disability made everything harder. Yet here he was, his fingers gentle on useless legs, his expression concentrated and serious, like this was the most important task in the world. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. He looked up at her and wrote with one hand while continuing to work with the other. "I know. I want to." "Why?" His pencil paused, and she saw him struggle with how to express something that didn't have easy words. Finally, he wrote, "Because you've spent 4 years doing everything alone. Because nobody should have to be that strong all the time. Because taking care of each other is what marriage means, at least the kind I want ours to be." Margaret felt tears burn behind her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She would not cry again. She'd cried more in the past 2 days than in the previous 4 years combined, and it felt dangerous, like if she started she might never stop. But Elias's words had cracked something open that she'd kept carefully sealed, the loneliness, the bone-deep exhaustion of being the only person she could rely on. "I'm afraid I'll slow you down," she admitted in a voice barely above a whisper. "That my limitations will get us all killed." Elias set down his pencil and took both her hands in his, waiting until she met his eyes. Then he pointed to her heart, to her head, to the rifle she'd held steady during the chase. He pointed to the canyon around them, to Joseph and Marcus standing watch. His meaning was clear even without words. Strength came in many forms, and the ability to walk was only one measure of it. Margaret squeezed his hands, trying to communicate everything she couldn't say. Gratitude and fear, and the beginning of something that felt terrifyingly like love. He squeezed back, and they stayed like that for a long moment, connected by understanding that went deeper than language. Joseph appeared at the cave entrance, his silhouette dark against the bright morning light. "You two should eat something and try to sleep. We'll wake you when the sun starts to set. Tonight's going to be harder than last night." "Why?" Margaret asked. "Because now Tate knows which direction we're going. He'll have men riding hard to get ahead of us, set up ambushes at the likely water sources and mountain passes." Joseph's face was grim. "And because the man Marcus shot last night died. I went back to check while you were sleeping. That makes this murder now. They won't just want to capture us. They'll want revenge." The words hung heavy in the cave air. A man was dead. Killed by Marcus, but dead because of their flight, because of Margaret's refusal to give up her father's land. She should have felt guilt, maybe, or horror. Instead, she felt only a grim determination. That man had been riding with Tate's thugs, had been shooting at them in the dark, had been trying to drag them back to imprisonment, or worse. His death was unfortunate, but not undeserved. "How long until they catch up?" Elias wrote. "Hours, maybe. Maybe not until tonight if we're lucky. Depends how many men Tate sends, and how willing they are to push their horses to exhaustion." Joseph squatted down, using a stick to draw in the dirt floor of the cave. "We're here. Laramie's about 40 miles northeast. Between here and there are 3 mountain passes. If they're smart, they'll set up at the passes and wait for us to come to them." "Can we go around?" Margaret asked. Marcus, who'd come to join them, shook his head. "Not with the wagon. The alternate routes are too rough. Your chair would never survive it, and we'd have to leave the supplies behind. We have to go through the passes or give up and turn back. Margaret set her jaw. We're not turning back. Didn't think so, Marcus said with something that might have been approval. Then we need to be smarter than them. They'll expect us to take the most direct route. What if we don't? He leaned over Joseph's map and pointed to a different path. This route adds a day to our journey, maybe more, but it only has one narrow pass, and it's through Cheyenne tribal land. Tate's men won't have the same freedom to operate there. The tribal police have jurisdiction, and they're less friendly to white ranchers than territorial law enforcement. Will the tribal police help us? Margaret asked. Joseph and Marcus exchanged another of those wordless sibling conversations. Depends, Joseph said finally. Some might. Others might see us as just more trouble they don't need. But at minimum, Tate's men will have to be more careful. Can't just start shooting on tribal land without consequences. Elias wrote, How well do you know the tribal police? Our cousin is one, Marcus said. Samuel Fasthorse. He's complicated. Angry at the world, and not without reason. But he's fair. If we can reach him, explain what's happening, he might give us safe passage through tribal land. Might, Joseph emphasized. No guarantees. Samuel's been burned by white promises before. He might not care about your father's work or your fight with Tate. But he'll care about you, Margaret said, understanding. Your family. Marcus's expression was hard. Family doesn't always mean what it should. Samuel blames our father for assimilating, for teaching us English, for sending us to white schools. Says we betrayed our people by trying to live in both worlds. He's not wrong, exactly, but he's not completely right, either. The complexity of it all made Margaret's head hurt. She'd thought this was a simple story, good people fighting bad ones, justice versus corruption. But nothing was simple. The Broken Lance brothers carried their own burdens, their own conflicts between who they were and who the world wanted them to be. Just like her. Just like Elias. We try for tribal land, Margaret decided. It's our best chance, even if it's not a guarantee. Elias nodded agreement and wrote, When do we leave? Sunset, Joseph said. Get some rest while you can, all of you. Marcus and I will keep watch and plan the route in more detail. But rest was elusive. Margaret dozed fitfully, her dreams full of gunfire and falling and her father's face the last time she'd seen him alive, telling her to be strong, to never give up the fight. She woke with a gasp to find Elias sitting beside her wheelchair, his hand on her shoulder, his face concerned in the dim cave light. Sorry, she whispered. Bad dreams. He wrote, Me too. Always me too. They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the wind whistle through the canyon outside. Margaret studied Elias's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the scar on his throat that should have killed him, but hadn't. She wondered what he'd been like before the war, before violence and loss had carved him into this quiet, fierce man. She wondered if she'd have liked that version of him, or if she needed this one, the one who understood survival and sacrifice and the way suffering could either break you or forge you into something stronger. Tell me something true, she said suddenly, something about yourself that nobody else knows. Elias looked at her for a long moment, then reached for his notebook. His pencil moved slowly, carefully, like each word cost him something to write. Before the war, I wanted to be a teacher, she read. Had this idea that I'd travel around to frontier towns, teach children to read and write, maybe start my own school someday. Thought education was the key to making the world better. Then the war came, and I learned that the world doesn't get better through education or good intentions. It gets better through people willing to do hard things in hard times. When I lost my voice, I thought I'd lost my chance to teach anyone anything. But watching you these past few days, I realize I was wrong. You teach just by existing. You teach that broken things can still be whole, that powerless people can still have power, that sometimes the bravest thing is just refusing to quit. If I never teach another thing in my life, knowing you taught me that is enough. Margaret read the words twice, 3 times, feeling them sink into her bones like warmth after long cold. I'm not brave, she said. I'm just stubborn. Elias smiled and wrote, Same thing, usually. I'm terrified all the time. Every decision feels wrong. Every step forward feels like I'm leading people toward disaster. That's what makes it courage, Elias wrote. doing it anyway, even though you're scared. Margaret wanted to argue, to explain that real courage was what he'd shown pulling a gun on a sheriff, what Joseph and Marcus showed riding into gunfire. But before she could find the words, Marcus called out from the cave entrance. "Riders! Main trail heading north, maybe 6 of them." Everyone was instantly alert. Elias moved to peer out carefully while Margaret gripped her rifle, checking the load, even though she'd checked it a dozen times already. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she listened to the sound of hoofbeats passing below their position. "Tate's men?" she whispered. Marcus nodded grimly. "Heading for the northern pass, probably, setting up exactly where we thought they would." "Good thing we're not going that way," Joseph said with satisfaction. But Margaret saw the concern in the brothers' eyes, the way they exchanged another wordless look. "What is it?" she demanded. "What aren't you telling me?" "If they're sending 6 men to block the northern pass," Marcus said slowly, "that means they're taking this seriously, which means there are probably more men watching the other routes. Tate's throwing everything he has at catching us." "How many men does he have?" Elias wrote. 20, maybe 30, including deputies and hired guns, Joseph answered. "Not all of them will be reliable. Some are just ranch hands who'll run at the first sign of real trouble. But the core group, Tate's real enforcers, maybe 8 to 10 men who'll kill without hesitation if the money's right." Margaret did the math. 4 of them against potentially 10 experienced killers, plus however many deputies Calloway could muster. The odds were worse than she'd thought, and they'd already been terrible. "We could still turn back," Marcus said quietly. "Hide with the Cheyenne camp, wait for Tate to give up looking." "He won't give up," Margaret said flatly. "And even if we hide, he'll just come after the people helping us. We keep going, or we surrender. Those are the only options." Elias wrote quickly. "Then we keep going. Tonight, tribal land. Find your cousin, one step at a time." The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. Margaret forced herself to eat dried meat and hard bread, even though anxiety had killed her appetite. She checked and rechecked her rifle, cleaned and oiled the mechanism, made sure she had extra ammunition within easy reach. Elias did the same with his guns, the rifle and the Colt revolver, his movements methodical and precise. Joseph and Marcus prepared their own weapons while discussing the route in low voices, pointing at landmarks visible through the cave entrance. They seemed calm, almost relaxed, and Margaret envied their composure. She felt like she might vibrate apart from tension. As the sun finally began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of red and gold that looked like fire, they prepared to move. Elias helped Margaret into the wagon, securing her wheelchair with extra rope this time. If they had to run again, they couldn't afford to have it shift and potentially crush her. "If something happens," Margaret said as Elias worked, "if we get separated or things go bad..." He pressed his fingers gently against her lips, stopping the words. Then he wrote, "Nothing's going to happen. We stay together, all of us. That's the promise." "You can't promise that." "Watch me," his eyes said, even though his scarred throat couldn't form the words. The fierce determination in his gaze made her believe him, against all logic and reason. They left the cave as the last light was fading, moving quietly through the canyon toward the eastern trail that would take them toward tribal land. The journey was slower than Margaret would have liked, the wagon limited by terrain that Joseph and Marcus's ponies could navigate easily. Every sound made her flinch, every scrape of rock, every horse's snort, every distant bird call that might not be a bird at all. Hours passed in tense silence. The moon rose, fuller than the night before, providing more light but also making them more visible. Marcus ranged ahead, scouting the trail, while Joseph stayed closer to provide immediate support if needed. Elias drove with intense concentration, his eyes constantly scanning for danger. They were perhaps 10 miles from their cave, climbing toward the pass that would take them into tribal territory, when Marcus came racing back, his pony lathered and blowing hard. "Ambush," he said tersely. "At least 4 men positioned in the rocks above the trail. They're not trying to hide. They want us to see them, want us to know we're trapped." "Can we go around?" Elias wrote quickly. "Not without abandoning the wagon. The terrain's too rough." Marcus's jaw was tight with frustration. They picked their position well. Margaret felt ice settle in her stomach. This was it then, the confrontation she'd been dreading and half expecting. What do we do? Joseph had joined them now, his rifle already in his hands. We have three choices: turn back, abandon the wagon, and try to proceed on horseback with Margaret, or talk our way through. Talk? Margaret's voice came out sharper than she intended. You think they'll just let us pass if we ask nicely? No, Joseph said calmly. But maybe they'll negotiate. Tate wants you alive. He needs you to sign over the land, or at least that's what he's been trying for. Dead, you're just a problem and a scandal. Maybe we can use that. Or, Marcus added grimly, we fight. 4 against 4 are better odds than we've had so far. Margaret looked at Elias, trying to read his opinion in his eyes. He was staring ahead at the trail, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he wrote, We try talking first. If that fails, we fight. But we don't turn back. If we fight, some of us might die, Joseph said bluntly, looking at each of them in turn. Need to be clear about that. This isn't warning shots in the dark anymore. This is close quarters against men who know how to kill. I understand, Margaret said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. We try to talk. We fight if we must. We don't surrender. The brothers nodded, and something passed between the 4 of them, an understanding that they were all committed now, that whatever happened next, they'd face it together. Margaret felt the weight of that commitment, the responsibility of knowing that people might die because of her stubbornness, her refusal to let go of land and justice, and her father's memory. But she also felt something else, pride maybe, or purpose. For 4 years she'd been helpless, dependent, watching the world happen around her while she could only endure. Now she was acting. Now she was fighting. If she died tonight, at least she'd die as a participant in her own story rather than a victim of someone else's. They moved forward slowly, deliberately, making no effort to hide their approach. When they rounded the bend and the ambush point came into view, Margaret saw exactly what Marcus had described. 4 men positioned in rocks above the trail, rifles aimed down, with no cover for anyone passing below. It was a perfect killing field. One of the men stood as they approached, stepping into full view. Margaret recognized him even at a distance. Jack Reeves, the scarred thug from the church, his right wrist still bandaged from where Elias had nearly broken it. His grin was visible even in the moonlight, sharp and mean. Well, well, Reeves called down. The cripple and her collection of misfits. Took you long enough to get here. We've been waiting. Elias brought the wagon to a stop and set the brake. He wrote quickly and showed the note to Margaret. Let me handle this. But Margaret shook her head. This was her fight, her land, her father's legacy. She wouldn't hide behind Elias, no matter how much he wanted to protect her. She raised her voice, projecting confidence she didn't feel. Reeves, I'd say it's a pleasure, but we both know I'd be lying. Feelings mutual, sweetheart. Reeves spat tobacco juice over the edge of the rock. But you're out of options now. Mayor Tate's been real patient with you, but patience has limits. Time to come on back to Sweetwater Springs and have a reasonable conversation about that land of yours. You mean time to be threatened and coerced until I sign forged documents? Margaret shot back. I don't think so. See, that's what I love about you, Margaret. You got spirit. Reeves's grin widened. But spirit don't stop bullets. Now you got 2 choices. Come peaceful, or we shoot your horses out from under you and drag you back in chains. Either way, you're going back. Margaret felt Elias tense beside her, felt Joseph and Marcus shift their positions subtly, preparing for violence. The night air was thick with tension, every breath feeling like it might be the last peaceful one they'd take. What about my companions? Margaret asked, buying time, trying to think of any possible way out of this. They've done nothing wrong except help a woman travel safely. You going to murder innocent men for doing the decent thing? Innocent? Reeves laughed, harsh and ugly. Your mute husband assaulted me in a church, pulled a gun on Sheriff Calloway in your home. These 2, he gestured dismissively at Joseph and Marcus, killed Billy Tucker last night. That's 3 counts of assault and 1 count of murder. They're coming back too, to face justice. Tate's justice, Joseph said quietly, which is to say, no justice at all. Don't matter what you call it, Reeves said. End result's the same. Now, I'm going to count to 10. If you ain't climbing down from that wagon by the time I hit 10, we start shooting. And we'll start with the horses, so you can watch them die before we move on to your Indian friends here." He started counting. Margaret's mind raced, searching desperately for options and finding none. They couldn't fight. The position was too good, the cover too solid. They couldn't run. The horses were already tired, and they'd be shot in the back before they made 50 feet. They couldn't negotiate. Reeves had orders and no authority to deviate from them. 6, 7. Elias's hand found Margaret's, squeezed once, hard. She looked at him and saw apology in his eyes, saw him making calculations about what he could do, how many he could take with him before they cut him down. He was preparing to sacrifice himself to give her a chance to escape. "No," Margaret whispered. "Don't you dare." 8. Marcus and Joseph had their rifles up now, tracking targets. It would be a bloodbath. Everyone would die, and for what? For land? For pride? For a justice system that had never worked for people like them anyway? 9. Margaret opened her mouth to surrender, to tell Elias and the brothers to stand down, that she wouldn't let them die for her stubbornness. But before she could speak, a new voice cut through the night, sharp, commanding, speaking in Cheyenne. Everyone froze. Margaret looked up to see a man standing on the rocks opposite Reeves's position, a rifle in his hands aimed steadily at Reeves's head. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a mix of traditional and modern clothing, with a badge glinting on his chest. Tribal police. Joseph let out a breath that sounded like relief. "Samuel!" The newcomer spoke again in Cheyenne, longer this time, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Reeves's men shifted nervously, their guns now divided between targets, Margaret's group and this new threat. "What's he saying?" Margaret whispered. "He's telling them this is tribal land," Marcus translated quietly, "that they have no jurisdiction here, that if they fire a single shot, he'll consider it an act of war against the Cheyenne Nation and respond accordingly. He's asking them to leave, now." Reeves's grin had frozen on his face, but his eyes were calculating. "This ain't tribal land. We're still 50 yards from the boundary." Samuel Fasthorse spoke in heavily accented English, each word carefully pronounced. "You are wrong. Boundary was moved in Treaty of 1868. These rocks are Cheyenne territory. You are trespassing. Leave or be arrested." "On what charge?" Reeves demanded. "Threatening innocent travelers with violence, disturbing the peace, trespassing on tribal land." Samuel's rifle didn't waver. "I can find more charges if needed. We have time." The standoff stretched, taut as a wire ready to snap. Margaret could see Reeves thinking, weighing his options. He had orders from Tate, but those orders probably didn't include starting a war with the tribal police. The territorial government might tolerate Tate's corruption, but they wouldn't tolerate actions that risked another Indian war. Finally, Reeves lowered his rifle with obvious reluctance. "Fine. But this ain't over. You're just delaying the inevitable, Margaret. Tate will get what he wants. He always does." "Perhaps," Samuel said calmly, "but not tonight. Not on my land. Leave now." Reeves and his men withdrew, mounting horses that had been hidden in the rocks and riding back toward Sweetwater Springs. Margaret watched them go, hardly daring to believe they'd actually left, that Samuel Fasthorse had just saved their lives with nothing but words and a steady rifle. When the hoofbeats had faded completely, Samuel climbed down from his position and approached the wagon. Up close, Margaret could see the resemblance to Joseph and Marcus, the same sharp features, the same intelligent eyes. But where the brothers had found some accommodation with the white world, Samuel carried his anger like armor, visible in every rigid line of his body. He spoke in Cheyenne to his cousins, his tone clipped and formal. Joseph responded in the same language, gesturing to Margaret and Elias. The conversation went back and forth, growing heated at times, until finally Samuel turned to address Margaret directly. "My cousins tell me you fight against the man who steals land from our people," he said in careful English. "They say your father was friend to the Cheyenne, that he tried to stop the theft before he was murdered." "That's true," Margaret confirmed, "and I'm trying to finish what he started. We're heading to Laramie to find evidence of the land fraud, to present it to authorities who might actually care about justice." Samuel's expression was skeptical. "White man's justice has never served our people. Why should it serve you?" It was a fair question, and Margaret didn't have a good answer. Maybe it won't, she admitted. Maybe this whole journey is pointless, and we'll all die or fail or get arrested. But I have to try, because if I don't, then my father died for nothing, and if I don't, then Randall Tate wins, and he keeps stealing and killing until there's nothing left worth saving. Samuel studied her in silence, his dark eyes unreadable. Finally he spoke again, this time in Cheyenne directed at Joseph and Marcus. Whatever he said made both brothers relax slightly, their relief obvious. "What did he say?" Margaret asked. Marcus smiled slightly. "He said you have the heart of someone who's lost everything but refuses to be broken. He said he understands that heart because he has it too. He'll give us safe passage through tribal land and provide escort to make sure no one else tries what Reeves did. But," Joseph added, his tone warning, "he says if we fail, if white man's justice proves to be as worthless as he expects, we're welcome to return to tribal land and live as Cheyenne. All of us." He glanced at Margaret. "Even you." The offer was unexpected and deeply moving. Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Tell him thank you. Tell him I hope we succeed, but if we don't, I'd be honored to accept his hospitality." Samuel nodded when Marcus translated, then spoke again in English. "We leave at dawn. Tonight you rest in my camp under tribal protection. Eat, sleep, prepare. Tomorrow we ride hard for the boundary near Laramie. After that you're on your own again." He turned and walked away into the darkness, moving with the same quiet confidence his cousins displayed. Joseph and Marcus immediately relaxed, the tension draining from their shoulders. "That went better than I expected," Marcus said. "Samuel's angry, but he's not unreasonable," Joseph agreed. "Come on, let's get you to the camp before he changes his mind." They followed Samuel through the darkness to a small cluster of lodges hidden in a fold of hills. Other tribal police were there, and families who lived under Samuel's protection. Women came forward to help Margaret, speaking in rapid Cheyenne and gesturing for her to follow them. They led her to a lodge where she could rest, where there were soft furs to lie on, and warm food cooking over a central fire. Elias stayed close, unwilling to let her out of his sight, even in relative safety. The women seemed to understand and made space for him, offering food and water with the same quiet hospitality they showed Margaret. One older woman examined Margaret's wheelchair with interest, testing the wheels and the frame, then said something to Elias in Cheyenne while making hand signs. Elias signed back, and the woman nodded, disappearing briefly before returning with leather straps and thick padding. She and Elias worked together to reinforce the wheelchair, adding cushioning to places that had worn through, securing loose joints, improving it in ways that would make the rest of the journey less painful. Margaret watched them work and felt tears threaten again. These people owed her nothing. Their own lives were hard enough without taking on the burdens of a white woman's fight. Yet here they were, sharing food and shelter and skill, treating her not like a charity case, but like someone worth helping. When the wheelchair was finished, the old woman touched Margaret's cheek gently and spoke in Cheyenne. She didn't need translation to understand the sentiment. "You are not alone. We see you. We help." That night, Margaret slept more soundly than she had since before her father's death. The lodge was warm, the furs were soft, and most importantly, she was surrounded by people who'd chosen to stand with her. Elias lay nearby, close enough to touch if she reached out, far enough to be respectful of the space they were sharing with others. His presence was a comfort that went beyond physical protection. He was her anchor, her reminder that she'd chosen correctly when she'd said yes to his silent proposal. She woke before dawn to find him already awake, sitting cross-legged near the fire, cleaning his guns one more time. His movements were meditative, practiced, the ritual of a soldier preparing for battle. When he noticed her watching, he set aside the rifle and came to her, helping her transfer to the wheelchair without needing to be asked. "Today we cross into Wyoming territory proper," she said quietly, not wanting to wake the others. "After that, we're only a day from Laramie if we push hard." Elias wrote, "And if Tate's men are waiting, then we fight," Margaret said, surprised by how calm she felt saying it. "Or we die. But we don't quit. Not when we're this close." He studied her face in the dim firelight, then wrote, "You've changed since I met you. Harder somehow, but not in a bad way, like steel that's been tempered. I had to change. The girl I was before the accident, before my father died. She couldn't have done this. She wasn't strong enough. Sometimes I think the accident and everything after was the price I had to pay to become someone who could fight back. That's a hell of a price, Elias wrote. Yes, Margaret agreed, but maybe it was worth it. Ask me again when this is over. They shared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and dried berries with Samuel and the brothers while the camp stirred to life around them. Samuel explained the route they'd take, a narrow trail that skirted the edge of tribal land before rejoining the main road just south of Laramie. It would be dangerous for a few hours, exposed and visible, but it was the fastest path that kept them under tribal protection for as long as possible. Once you cross the boundary, Samuel said, his English more fluid this morning, you're back under territorial law. I can't follow you there without causing problems my people don't need. You'll be alone again. We understand, Margaret said. You've already done more than we had any right to ask. Samuel looked at her with those sharp, intelligent eyes. Your father spoke for my people when others stayed silent. That creates obligation. Also, and here his expression softened slightly, my cousins believe in you. They're good judges of character. If they're willing to die for your cause, then it must be worthy. The words hung heavy with meaning. Joseph and Marcus had been quiet about their commitment, but hearing it stated so baldly made Margaret's chest ache. These men barely knew her, yet they'd already killed for her, already risked everything for her impossible quest. I don't want anyone to die for me, she said. Then win, Samuel replied simply. Winning means we live to fight other battles. Losing means we die for nothing. So win. They left as the sun was climbing, 5 riders moving swiftly across land that looked empty, but Margaret was learning was full of life if you knew how to see it. Samuel rode ahead, proud and straight in the saddle, his rifle across his lap. Joseph and Marcus flanked the wagon, alert and ready. Elias drove with that same intense concentration he'd shown throughout the journey. Margaret sat beside him, her own rifle within reach, watching the horizon for any sign of pursuit or ambush. Her body ached from days of hard travel, her spine sending constant complaints that the tea could only partially dull. But her mind was clear, focused, ready for whatever came next. The hours passed in tense watchfulness. They saw riders in the distance several times, impossible to tell if they were Tate's men or just regular travelers. Each time, Samuel would ride ahead to investigate, returning with reports that they were clear to proceed. His presence alone seemed to deter anyone from approaching too closely. Around midday, they reached the boundary. It wasn't marked by anything official, just a change in the land, a shift from the protected territory into open Wyoming. Samuel pulled his horse to a stop and sat for a moment, looking at the road ahead. Then he spoke in Cheyenne, long and formal. Joseph translated quietly for Margaret and Elias. He says the land ahead is hungry for blood, says he can feel it the way animals feel coming storms. He says to be watchful, to be ready, to remember that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and riding forward anyway. He says we honor our ancestors by fighting even when we know we might lose. He says go with the Spirit's protection, and if we fall as warriors. Samuel turned his horse and rode back toward tribal land without looking back. Margaret watched him go, this proud, angry man who'd saved them despite having every reason not to, and silently promised she'd make his help mean something. How far to Laramie? She asked. 6 hours if we don't stop, Marcus answered. Maybe 8 if we're careful. Then let's be careful but quick, Margaret decided. I want to reach Judge Abernathy before nightfall. They rode hard, the wagon bouncing over rough terrain, the horses pushed to the edge of their endurance. Margaret's world narrowed to pain and determination and the constant scan of the horizon for threats. Every shadow could be an ambush. Every rise could hide enemies, but they kept moving, kept pushing, kept refusing to surrender to fear or fatigue. The sun was touching the western horizon when Laramie finally appeared, a sprawl of buildings that looked almost civilized compared to Sweetwater Springs, with proper streets and brick buildings, and the suggestion of law that actually meant something. Margaret felt hope kindle in her chest for the first time in days. They'd made it. Against all odds, through violence and fear and exhaustion, they'd actually made it. Then she saw the riders blocking the road ahead, and hope turned to ice. There were at least a dozen of them, spread across the trail in a line that made it clear they weren't moving. Sheriff Calloway sat in the center on a big bay horse, his badge glinting in the fading light. Beside him was Mayor Randall Tate himself, smiling that cold, predatory smile Margaret had learned to hate. "End of the line, Margaret," Tate called out as they approached. "I have to admire your persistence, but this foolishness stops now." Margaret felt the familiar weight of despair trying to settle on her shoulders, but she refused to let it take hold. They hadn't come this far, survived this much, just to surrender now with Laramie visible in the distance. She could see the town's church steeple rising against the darkening sky, could almost imagine Judge Abernathy in his office somewhere among those buildings, unaware that the daughter of his old friend was so close and yet potentially so impossibly far away. Elias brought the wagon to a stop, his body coiled with tension. Joseph and Marcus moved their ponies closer, forming a protective semicircle around the wagon. Margaret counted the men facing them, 12, just as she'd thought, all armed, all wearing expressions that ranged from bored to actively hostile. These weren't just Tate's usual thugs. She recognized 2 territorial deputies among them, men who should have been upholding the law rather than helping a corrupt mayor hunt down a woman trying to expose his crimes. "Mayor Tate," Margaret said, keeping her voice level despite the fear hammering in her chest. "Funny seeing you so far from Sweetwater Springs. Don't you have a town to run into the ground?" Tate's smile widened, but his eyes stayed cold as January ice. "Oh, I do. But when one of my citizens goes missing, when she's clearly been kidnapped by a mute drifter and a couple of renegade Indians, well, I feel obligated to mount a rescue operation. It's what any responsible public servant would do." The lie was so brazen Margaret almost laughed. "Kidnapped? I'm traveling with my husband and hired escorts. Last I checked, that wasn't illegal." "Your husband," Tate repeated, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Yes, let's talk about him. Elias Ward wanted for assault on a peace officer. And your escorts, Joseph and Marcus Broken Lance, wanted for the murder of Billy Tucker. You're not traveling with protectors, Margaret. You're traveling with criminals, and I'm here to bring them to justice." Sheriff Calloway rode forward a few paces, his hand resting on his gun. "Elias Ward, you're under arrest for assault on my person and on Jack Reeves. Joseph and Marcus Broken Lance, you're under arrest for murder. Come peacefully, and nobody else needs to get hurt." Margaret felt Elias tense beside her, felt Joseph and Marcus shift into fighting positions. This was it, the moment where they either surrendered or started a gunfight they couldn't win. 12 against 4, with Margaret unable to even stand to fight. The math was brutal and unforgiving. But before anyone could move, another voice cut through the evening air, cultured, authoritative, carrying the kind of confidence that came from years of wielding legitimate power. "Sheriff Calloway, I wasn't aware the Sweetwater Springs jurisdiction extended all the way to Laramie. Perhaps you'd care to explain what legal authority you have to make arrests in my county." A man rode forward from the direction of town, flanked by 2 riders wearing deputy badges that Margaret didn't recognize. The speaker was older, maybe 60, with iron gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore a suit that suggested education and means, and he sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone who'd been doing it his whole life. Margaret's heart leaped with desperate hope. "Judge Abernathy?" The man's stern expression softened slightly when he looked at her. "Margaret Hale? Good Lord, child, you look just like your mother. Samuel wrote to me about your marriage, but I didn't expect to see you quite so soon." He turned his attention back to Calloway and Tate, his expression hardening. "Now, gentlemen, I'll ask again. What authority do you have to operate in Albany County?" Tate's smile had frozen on his face, his mind clearly racing to adjust to this new complication. "Judge Abernathy, this is a simple matter of fugitives fleeing justice. We've been in pursuit for 3 days. I have warrants signed by Judge Morrison in Sweetwater Springs." "Judge Morrison," Abernathy interrupted, "who happens to be your brother-in-law. How convenient. I'd like to see these warrants, please." Calloway fumbled in his coat and produced folded papers, riding forward to hand them to Abernathy. The judge examined them carefully, his expression growing progressively more skeptical. Finally, he looked up with something that might have been contempt. "These warrants are improperly filed. The assault charge against Mr. Ward has no sworn testimony from the alleged victim, just Sheriff Calloway's statement, which makes it hearsay. The murder charge against the Broken Lance brothers has no corroborating evidence listed, no witnesses named, no physical proof cited. These wouldn't stand up in any legitimate court. He tore the papers in half. Which means you have no legal authority to arrest anyone. Judge Abernathy, Tate said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, I don't think you understand the situation here. These people are dangerous criminals. What I understand, Abernathy cut him off, his voice sharp as a blade, is that the daughter of my oldest friend has traveled a long way to see me, and she's being harassed by men with questionable legal standing and obvious conflicts of interest. What I understand is that territorial law gives me jurisdiction over anyone physically present in Albany County, which means if anyone's going to make arrests here, it'll be me. He turned to his deputies. Gentlemen, I want you to escort Mrs. Ward and her companions into town. They're under my protection until I can sort out what's actually going on here. Margaret felt relief so intense she thought she might faint. But Tate wasn't finished. His false joviality had vanished completely, replaced by naked anger. You're making a mistake, Abernathy, a big one. This woman and her accomplices have caused nothing but trouble. They need to answer for their crimes. Then they'll answer to me, in my court, under proper legal procedure, Abernathy replied. Unless you're suggesting I don't have the authority to determine what happens in my own jurisdiction. That would be a very serious accusation to level at a territorial judge, Mayor Tate. The kind of accusation that might prompt me to look into your activities more closely. I imagine a man in your position wouldn't want that kind of scrutiny. The threat was clear, and Margaret saw calculation flash across Tate's face. He was weighing his options, push harder and risk Abernathy becoming an active enemy, or back down and regroup. The mayor had built his power on knowing when to press and when to retreat, and some instinct must have told him this wasn't the time for confrontation. Of course not, Judge, Tate said, his smile returning like a mask sliding back into place. I'm sure you'll handle this appropriately. We'll be staying in Laramie for a few days in case you need our testimony or assistance. I've taken rooms at the Grand Hotel. How thoughtful, Abernathy said dryly. Now, if you'll excuse us, I have guests to attend to. He turned his horse and gestured for Margaret's group to follow. Elias didn't hesitate, snapping the reins and urging the tired horses forward. As they passed through the line of Tate's men, Margaret felt hostile eyes on her, felt the weight of their anger and frustration. This wasn't over. Tate wouldn't give up just because one judge had intervened. But for now, for this moment, they were safe. The ride into Laramie felt surreal after days of constant danger. Elias drove slowly, carefully, while Judge Abernathy rode beside the wagon asking gentle questions about her journey and her father's death. Margaret answered as best she could, her mind still reeling from how close they'd come to disaster. Samuel's letter told me some of what's been happening, Abernathy said as they navigated the town's streets. But I'd like to hear the full story from you, everything your father discovered, everything that's happened since his death. Can you do that? Yes, Margaret said. That's why we came. We need access to the Territorial Land Office, to the original deed records. My father believed Tate has been forging documents, stealing land from families who can't afford to fight back legally. If we can compare the original deeds to the versions Tate's been filing, you'll have proof of fraud, Abernathy finished, which would not only invalidate every claim Tate's made, but potentially expose him to federal prosecution for defrauding the government. That's brilliant, Margaret. Your father trained you well. They arrived at a large house on the edge of town, clearly Judge Abernathy's residence, a two-story structure with a wraparound porch and well-tended gardens. A woman appeared on the porch as they pulled up, her face concerned but welcoming. Daniel, what on earth? She started, then stopped when she saw Margaret. Oh, my lord, is that Samuel Hale's girl? It is, Abernathy confirmed, dismounting. Martha, we have guests. 4 of them, and they've had a rough few days. Can you prepare rooms and something to eat? Martha Abernathy was already moving, calling for servants, organizing with the efficient grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime managing a judge's household. Within minutes, Margaret found herself being helped inside by kind hands, her wheelchair navigating the ramp that had clearly been added to accommodate visitors with mobility challenges. The house was warm and smelled like bread baking and wood smoke and safety. Margaret felt something inside her uncoil slightly, exhaustion rushing in to fill the space where adrenaline had been. Elias stayed close, his presence a constant reassurance, while Joseph and Marcus were shown to rooms in the back where they could rest and clean up. Judge Abernathy led Margaret to his study, a book-lined room that reminded her achingly of her father's office before Tate's men had ransacked it. He poured her a glass of brandy that she accepted gratefully, the burn of it helping to steady her frayed nerves. "Now," he said, settling into a leather chair across from her, "tell me everything." So she did. Starting with the day her father had told her he'd discovered irregularities in Tate's land claims, through the accident that had stolen her legs and the murder disguised as a hunting mishap, to the years of threats and pressure, to her marriage to Elias and the flight across Wyoming territory. Abernathy listened without interrupting, his expression growing progressively grimmer. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Finally, he spoke. "Samuel was one of the best men I've ever known. Honest to a fault, brave when it mattered, unwilling to look away from injustice, even when it would have been easier and safer. His death was a tragedy, and I've spent 2 years wishing I'd been there to help him. Maybe I could have—" He stopped, shaking his head. "But regret doesn't change the past. What matters is what we do now." "Can you help us?" Margaret asked. "Can you access the land office records?" "I can do better than that," Abernathy said. "I can subpoena them officially, which means Tate can't claim they were stolen or tampered with. And I can do it tonight, before Tate has a chance to send word to any Confederates who might be working in the land office. If there are forged documents, we'll find them." Hope bloomed in Margaret's chest, almost painful in its intensity. "And if we find proof? Then I'll issue warrants, real ones, properly filed, with evidence for Tate's arrest. I'll also send word to the territorial governor and the U.S. Marshal. Tate's been operating with impunity because he's controlled the local law enforcement, but he doesn't control me, and he doesn't control federal authorities." Abernathy's expression was fierce. "We'll bring him down, Margaret, for your father, for all the families he's destroyed, for justice." The words were everything Margaret had dreamed of hearing for 4 years, but she'd learned not to trust hope too easily. Tate's not going to let this happen without a fight. He's already killed to protect his secrets. He'll kill again. "Let him try," Abernathy said grimly. "I have deputies I trust, men who aren't on Tate's payroll, and I have friends in the territorial government who've been looking for a reason to investigate Sweetwater Springs for years. Tate's made enemies, Margaret, powerful ones. All we need is evidence, and his empire of corruption crumbles." A knock on the study door interrupted them. Martha Abernathy poked her head in, her expression apologetic. "I'm sorry to disturb, but there's a young man here asking to see Mrs. Ward. Says his name is Samuel Fasthorse, and he has important information." Margaret exchanged a startled look with Judge Abernathy. "Samuel? I thought he'd gone back to tribal land." "Show him in," Abernathy said. Samuel entered the study with that same proud bearing he'd shown throughout their journey, but his face was tight with concern. He spoke rapidly in Cheyenne, and Margaret realized with frustration that she couldn't understand. Judge Abernathy, however, seemed to follow perfectly, his own expression growing alarmed. "What is it?" Margaret demanded. "What's he saying?" Abernathy held up a hand for patience as Samuel finished speaking. Then he turned to Margaret, his face grave. "Samuel followed Tate's men after we left. He wanted to make sure they actually went to the hotel, didn't try to circle back and ambush you. But instead of going to the hotel, they went to the telegraph office. Tate sent multiple wires. Samuel couldn't see who they were addressed to, but one of them was quite long. He believes Tate is calling in reinforcements and possibly alerting Confederates in Laramie to interfere with our investigation." Margaret felt cold dread settle in her stomach. "How long do we have?" "Hours, maybe. Depends how quickly people respond to Tate's summons." Abernathy stood decisively. "Which means we move now, tonight. I'll get the subpoena issued immediately and head to the land office with deputies. You and your people stay here where it's safe and defensible. If Tate's going to escalate, I don't want you caught in the crossfire." "I'm coming with you," Margaret said flatly. "Margaret, those are my father's documents, his work, his evidence, his legacy. I need to be there when we find them. I need to see this through. She met Abernathy's eyes with absolute determination. I didn't come all this way to hide in safety while other people fight my battles. Abernathy looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression must have convinced him it would be futile. Your father was just as stubborn, he said with a sigh. Fine, but you stay with me and my deputies at all times. Understood? Understood, Margaret agreed. Within an hour, they were moving through Laramie's darkened streets. Judge Abernathy, Margaret, Elias, 4 trusted deputies, and Samuel Fasthorse, who'd insisted on accompanying them despite Abernathy's concerns about jurisdiction. The land office was a squat brick building near the territorial courthouse, locked and dark at this hour. Abernathy produced keys and the official subpoena, letting them in with the authority of his position. Inside, the office smelled like old paper and dust and secrets waiting to be uncovered. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, each one containing hundreds of land deeds and property records dating back decades. Finding the specific documents they needed would take hours of searching. Sweetwater Springs claims from the past 5 years, Abernathy told his deputies. Start pulling every file. We'll need to examine signatures, dates, witness statements. Look for anything that seems irregular. They worked by lamplight, the deputies pulling files and stacking them on a large table where Margaret and Abernathy began the painstaking process of examination. Elias stayed close to Margaret, his presence protective, while Samuel and 1 deputy kept watch at the doors and windows. The first hour yielded nothing concrete, just the normal bureaucracy of land claims properly filed and witnessed. Margaret felt frustration building. What if they were wrong? What if her father had been mistaken? Or what if Tate had been more careful than they thought? Then Abernathy made a soft sound of discovery. Margaret, look at this. He held up 2 documents side by side. Both were deeds to the same property, 50 acres near Silver Creek, originally belonging to a Cheyenne family named 3 Ravens. The first deed, dated 1879, showed the family's traditional mark and the signature of Margaret's father as witnessing magistrate. The second deed, dated 1881, showed the same property being transferred to one of Tate's dummy corporations. But the witness signatures were different, and the 3 Ravens family's mark looked slightly off. The same general shape, but executed with less confidence, like someone copying something they didn't fully understand. This is a forgery, Abernathy said with certainty. The original deed is valid and properly witnessed. The second one transfers property that was never legally sold. If we can find more examples like this, we can prove systematic fraud, Margaret finished, her heart racing. Keep looking, there have to be more. They found them. Over the next 2 hours, they uncovered 17 separate cases where original deeds had been followed by forged transfers to Tate or his associates. Some were Cheyenne land, but others belonged to white families who'd probably been threatened or driven out. The pattern was clear and damning. Tate had been stealing land through forged documents for at least 5 years, maybe longer. This is enough, Abernathy said, his voice tight with controlled anger. This is more than enough to not only stop Tate, but to put him in prison for decades. We'll need to secure these documents, make copies, get them to the territorial governor and the U.S. Marshal immediately. Glass shattered as a window exploded inward. One of the deputies cried out and fell, blood blooming on his shoulder. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, bullets punching through windows and splintering the wooden doorframe. Get down! Abernathy shouted, diving behind a filing cabinet. Elias grabbed Margaret's wheelchair and pulled her behind the solid oak table, using his body to shield her. Return fire came from Samuel and the other deputies, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. How many? Abernathy called out. At least 6, maybe more, one deputy shouted back. Front and back entrances both covered. Margaret's mind raced. Tate had moved faster than they'd anticipated, or he'd had people watching the land office. Either way, they were trapped in a building with limited cover and multiple attackers. The files they needed were scattered across the table, vulnerable to fire or destruction. If they lost this evidence, they lost everything. We need to get these documents out, she said urgently to Abernathy. I'm open to suggestions on how, he replied, wincing as a bullet ricocheted off the filing cabinet above his head. Elias was writing frantically in his notebook, his handwriting almost illegible in his haste. He showed it to Margaret. Samuel and I can create diversion, get their attention, draw fire. Deputies can get you and documents out back door to courthouse. Safe there." "No," Margaret said immediately. "That's suicide. There are too many of them." Elias's eyes met hers, and she saw the determination there, the willingness to sacrifice himself so she could escape with the evidence that would destroy Tate. He wrote again, "Your father died for this. I won't let his death mean nothing. Get the files to safety. Finish what he started." Before Margaret could argue, Samuel spoke rapidly in Cheyenne, clearly agreeing with Elias's plan. The two men exchanged a quick series of hand signs, planning, coordinating, preparing to do something incredibly brave and incredibly foolish. "Listen to me," Margaret said fiercely, grabbing Elias's arm. "I didn't marry you just to watch you die 2 days later. We find another way. Together. All of us." But the gunfire was intensifying, and she could smell smoke. Someone had set fire to something outside, probably trying to burn them out or create chaos. They were running out of time and options. Judge Abernathy made the decision for them. "Do it," he told Elias and Samuel. "Make your diversion. My deputies and I will get Margaret and the documents to the courthouse. But don't die, damn you. Don't make this a suicide mission. Create chaos and get out. Understood?" Elias nodded once, then leaned down and kissed Margaret, fierce and quick and full of promise. Then he was moving, checking his guns, coordinating with Samuel using hand signs that Margaret couldn't quite follow. "When you hear the commotion at the front, we go out the back," Abernathy told his remaining deputies. "Fast and low. Get Mrs. Ward and these files to the courthouse. I'll send for the territorial marshal and the army post if necessary. This ends tonight." Margaret wanted to scream, wanted to demand they find a way that didn't involve Elias running toward danger. But she understood the math. If they all tried to leave together, none of them would make it. The only chance was to split their enemy's attention. She gripped her rifle and nodded. "I'm ready." Elias and Samuel moved to the front entrance, their movements coordinated despite never having worked together before. Through the shattered windows, Margaret could see shadows moving, Tate's men, maybe 10 of them now, trying to surround the building completely. Then Elias kicked the front door open and charged out into the street, his rifle blazing. Samuel followed a heartbeat later, both men firing with terrifying accuracy. Shouts erupted from Tate's men, confusion and return fire. Someone screamed. "Now!" Abernathy hissed. They ran, or rather, the deputies ran while one pushed Margaret's wheelchair at a pace that felt terrifyingly fast, the wheels bouncing over rough ground. She clutched the files to her chest with one hand and her rifle with the other, expecting at any moment to feel a bullet punch through her back. Gunfire continued behind them, echoing off buildings. Margaret heard glass breaking, heard men shouting orders, heard a hoarse scream. She forced herself not to look back, not to think about Elias facing 10 armed men with nothing but his rifle and his refusal to surrender. They burst through the courthouse doors and into the relative safety of thick stone walls. Abernathy immediately started shouting for assistance, for someone to wake the territorial marshal, for armed guards. His authority and obvious desperation galvanized the nighttime skeleton staff into action. But Margaret couldn't stop thinking about Elias, couldn't stop imagining him lying in the street, bleeding, dying because she'd asked him to marry her and fight her impossible fight. "I have to go back," she said, trying to turn her wheelchair toward the door. Abernathy's hand on her shoulder stopped her. "You can't. Your job is to stay alive and make sure this evidence gets to the right people. That's how you honor what Elias and Samuel are doing right now." "He's my husband," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "And he's fighting for you," Abernathy replied gently. "Don't make that sacrifice meaningless by getting yourself killed." The gunfire outside was diminishing, growing sporadic. Either Elias and Samuel were winning or they were dead. Margaret stared at the courthouse doors, her whole body rigid with the need to know, the need to help, the need to do something other than wait helplessly while others fought her battles. Then the doors burst open and Marcus and Joseph came through, supporting Samuel between them. The tribal policeman was bleeding from his arm and his face was covered in soot, but he was alive and conscious. "Where's Elias?" Margaret demanded, searching behind them for her husband's familiar form. "Coming," Joseph said tersely. "Had to grab something. Said it was important." Seconds stretched like hours. Then Elias appeared in the doorway, his shirt torn and bloody, his face grim with exhaustion and determination. In his arms he carried a box, one of the filing cabinets from the land office, its lock blown off, papers visible inside. He staggered to the table where Margaret sat and set the box down carefully. Then he wrote in his notebook, his hands shaking, "Backup copies. Tate's men set the office on fire. Most of the files will be destroyed, but I got these. The original deeds, the ones your father used to build his case. Everything you need." Margaret stared at the box, at the papers that had almost cost all of them their lives, at the evidence that could finally bring Tate to justice. Then she looked at Elias, at the blood soaking his shirt, at the exhaustion written in every line of his body, at the quiet triumph in his storm-gray eyes. "You're bleeding," she said stupidly. "Flesh wound," he wrote. "I've had worse. You could have died. Didn't." The smile he gave her was small but real. "Still have a marriage to figure out. Couldn't die yet." Margaret laughed, the sound coming out half-sob. She reached for him and he came to her, kneeling beside her wheelchair like he had that first day at the church. She held his face in her hands and kissed him properly this time, tasting smoke and blood and relief so intense it made her dizzy. "Don't ever do that again," she whispered against his lips. "Can't promise that," he wrote when she pulled back. "But I promise to try to survive it if I do." Judge Abernathy cleared his throat diplomatically. "As touching as this is, we have work to do. The territorial marshal is on his way, and I've sent word to the army post about the attack. They'll secure the area and arrest anyone connected to Tate. But first, we need to document what we have and make multiple copies. If Tate destroyed the land office to hide evidence, he'll certainly try to destroy what we rescued." The rest of the night passed in exhausting labor. They photographed documents, made handwritten copies, compiled lists of forged deeds and stolen lands. Martha Abernathy appeared with food and medical supplies, tending to Samuel's wounds and the injured deputy while the others worked. The territorial marshal arrived with a company of soldiers from the nearby army post, turning the courthouse into a fortress. Dawn was breaking when Judge Abernathy finally set down his pen and looked at the mountain of evidence they'd compiled. "This is it," he said with satisfaction. "This is everything we need to not only convict Tate, but to return land to its rightful owners. Your father would be proud, Margaret." Margaret felt tears burn behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not until this was truly finished. The soldiers found Tate and Calloway trying to leave town on the morning train. They were arrested without resistance, Tate's bluster finally failing him when faced with armed military force and legitimate legal authority. His hired guns scattered when they realized their employer couldn't protect them anymore. Within a week, 17 men had been arrested in connection with the land fraud scheme, including Judge Morrison and half the town council of Sweetwater Springs. The trials took months. Margaret testified, as did dozens of families who'd been victimized by Tate's schemes. The Cheyenne families whose land had been stolen spoke through translators, their quiet dignity more damning than any angry accusation. Elias couldn't testify in the traditional sense, but his written statements and the physical evidence he'd rescued from the burning land office spoke volumes. Tate was sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison for fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. Sheriff Calloway got 15 years. The others received sentences ranging from probation to 10 years, depending on their level of involvement. More importantly, every forged deed was invalidated, and land was returned to its rightful owners. Margaret's own land was secured completely, the debts Tate had manufactured erased as fraudulent. She suddenly had options she'd never dreamed of. She could sell the land for real money, could move somewhere easier, could start over without the weight of her father's death hanging over her. She chose to stay. With compensation from the territorial government and the return of properties her father had been trying to protect, Margaret had resources she'd never imagined. She used them to build a school on her land, a place where children of all backgrounds could learn, whether they were white or Cheyenne, able-bodied or disabled, rich or poor. Elias helped her design it with ramps and wide doorways, with spaces that accommodated different needs without making anyone feel less than whole. They hired Joseph and Marcus to teach alongside Margaret, Joseph handling practical skills and Marcus teaching Cheyenne language and customs. Samuel Fasthorse visited regularly, his anger softening slightly now that at least one small corner of the world had been set right. Mary Whitehorse came to the school dedication ceremony, tears streaming down her weathered face as she watched her great-grandson learn to read in the building that bore Samuel Hale's name. She pulled Margaret aside and pressed something into her hands. The carved bird Elias had made for their wedding, painstakingly repaired. Its broken wing now held together with delicate wire that somehow made it more beautiful than it had been whole. "A thing broken can be made stronger," Mary said. "This is what I told you. This is what you have become." Margaret looked at the bird, at the wire that held it together like scars that told stories of survival. She looked at Elias across the schoolyard, laughing silently at something one of the children had signed to him. She looked at the school that had risen from ashes and corruption and refused defeat. "Yes," she agreed, "we've all become that." That night, as they lay together in the house they'd expanded and improved, Elias traced the contours of her face with gentle fingers. In the months since the trials, they'd learned each other's languages, her words and his signs, her mobility challenges, and his voice-shaped silence. They'd learned that marriage was more than legal documents or convenient alliances. It was two broken people choosing to build something whole together. He wrote in the notebook he still kept by the bed, even though Margaret had learned to read his signs fluently. "Do you regret it? Any of it?" Margaret thought about her father, about the accident, about 4 years of pain and grief and fighting. She thought about this journey that had almost killed them, about the people who'd stood beside them against impossible odds. She thought about the school that would teach hundreds of children that their differences made them valuable rather than broken. "No," she said, and meant it completely. "Every terrible thing led me here, led me to you, led me to finally finishing what my father started. Regret would be an insult to everyone who fought and bled to make this possible." Elias smiled and pulled her close, and Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. True, uncomplicated peace. The kind that came from knowing you'd fought the right fight, survived the unsurvivable, and found love in the spaces between violence and hope. The statue came later, years after the school was established and the last of Tate's co-conspirators had been prosecuted. The town of Sweetwater Springs, under new leadership that actually served its citizens, commissioned it for the central square. The sculptor came to visit Margaret and Elias, asking questions about her father, about their journey, about what message they wanted to convey. Elias carved a small model from wood and showed it to the sculptor. A woman in a wheelchair, her head high, her hands not on the wheels but raised toward the sky like she was reaching for something just beyond her grasp. Beside her stood a man with one hand on her shoulder, the other holding a rifle pointed down but ready. And around them, carved into the base, were words that Margaret had written and Elias had approved. "Love does not need legs to stand, nor words to be heard. It needs only the courage to refuse surrender, and the grace to see each other as whole when the world calls us broken." They unveiled it on the 5th anniversary of her father's death. The entire town came, along with families from the Cheyenne Reservation and as far away as Laramie. Judge Abernathy gave a speech about justice and sacrifice. Samuel Fasthorse spoke in Cheyenne, his words translated by Joseph, about bridges between worlds being built by people brave enough to stand in the middle. But the moment Margaret remembered most came after the ceremony, when a young girl in a wheelchair, one of their students, rolled up to the statue and looked at it with wide eyes. "Is that really you, Mrs. Ward?" she asked. "A version of me," Margaret said. "Maybe the version I was always meant to become." The girl traced the carved hands reaching toward the sky. "You're not in your chair in this statue. You're standing." Margaret looked at Elias, who'd been watching the exchange with that quiet intensity he brought to everything important. He signed quickly, and the girl, who'd learned sign language in their school, translated. "He says you are standing. You've been standing all along. The statue just shows what's always been true." And Margaret realized he was right. She'd spent 4 years thinking of herself as the girl who fell, the cripple who'd lost the use of her legs and had to learn to survive with less. But that had never been the truth. She was the woman who'd saved a child and paid the price without regret, the woman who'd refused to sell her soul for safety, the woman who'd married a silent stranger and learned to hear everything he couldn't say. the woman who'd ridden across Wyoming territory with a price on her head and lived to tell the tale. She'd been standing all along. She just hadn't known how to see it until someone loved her enough to show her. Years later, when Margaret and Elias were old and gray, and the school had expanded to 3 buildings with 4 teachers and 70 students, someone asked Margaret what she'd learned from her journey. She thought about it for a long time before answering. "I learned that breaking isn't the end," she said finally. "It's just the middle. The interesting part comes after, when you decide what to do with the pieces. You can hide them, pretend they don't exist, let them define you as damaged, or you can gather them up, figure out how they fit together differently now, and build something that could never have existed if you hadn't broken first. I learned that love isn't finding someone perfect. It's finding someone broken in complementary ways so your sharp edges fit their hollow spaces, and together you're both more whole than you were apart. I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's riding forward anyway, when every part of you is screaming to run away. And I learned that my father died fighting for something that mattered. But I live fighting for the same thing, and living, continuing the fight day after day, year after year, that's its own kind of victory." Elias, sitting beside her with his hand intertwined with hers like it had been for decades, signed his agreement. The language they'd built together, part ASL, part Cheyenne signs, part their own invention, said everything words couldn't. That he saw her, that she saw him, that they'd fought their way to each other through fire and blood and impossible odds, and they'd do it again in a heartbeat. Margaret looked at the school, at the children playing in the yard regardless of race or ability, at the statue that had become a symbol of something larger than one woman's fight. She looked at the town that had almost destroyed her and that she'd helped rebuild into something better. She looked at the life she'd carved from the ruins of tragedy and terror and overwhelming grief. "Was it worth it?" someone asked. "All the pain, all the fear, all the cost." Margaret thought about her father, who died for justice and never got to see it achieved. She thought about Elias taking a bullet meant for her and carrying scars he'd bear forever. She thought about Joseph and Marcus risking everything to help someone who could offer them nothing in return. She thought about Samuel Fasthorse and Mary Whitehorse and Judge Abernathy and everyone who'd stood beside her when standing was dangerous. "Yes," she said simply, "it was worth it, not despite the cost, but because of it. We paid in blood and pain and fear for something that will outlive us all. That's what my father understood. That's what Elias showed me. Some things are worth dying for, but more importantly, they're worth living for, fighting for them every day, building them piece by piece, refusing to let go even when it would be so much easier to quit." The sun was setting over the Wyoming Valley, painting the sky in colors that still hurt to look at because they were so beautiful. Margaret watched it with Elias beside her, their hands linked, their scars visible and honored, their brokenness transformed into a wholeness that could only exist because of what they'd endured. They'd started as 2 shattered people brought together by desperation and convenience. They'd become warriors, partners, lovers, builders of something larger than themselves. They'd taken a world that wanted them to be small and powerless and broken, and they'd refused. They'd fought. They'd won. And they'd learned that sometimes the greatest victories aren't the ones where you defeat your enemies. They're the ones where you refuse to let your enemies define who you are, where you take your pain and your limitations and your losses, and you use them as foundation stones to build something beautiful and true and unshakable. Margaret Hale Ward, the girl who couldn't walk but learned to fly anyway, had become exactly who she was always meant to be, not despite her breaking, but because of it. And that, in the end, was the only victory that truly mattered,